Under His Watch, Book 2 in the Heroes of Eastbrooke Christian Romance Suspense series, written by Juliette Duncan, narrated by Jessie Sweeney. Prologue. Rob circled the block near Emma's house, a warning voice whispering in his head. Something's wrong. A sense of urgency tugged at him. The inner voice was growing louder. She's in danger. Years of being on the police force had taught him to trust his instincts. He hit the gas and sped towards her house, rehearsing what reason he'd give her for turning up on her doorstep unannounced. After everything she'd been through, the last thing he wanted was to scare her even more. But if nothing was wrong and he came up with a lame excuse, like inviting her for coffee again, what would she think? That he was pushing her? Not that he didn't want to see her again, but the next time he'd properly ask her on a date. That was, after she'd had the chance to know him better and see for herself that he wasn't the flirtatious guy who dated a different girl every weekend. He only had himself to blame for her opinion of him. It was a carefully cultivated image, designed to stop people from getting too close. Yet, with Emma, things were different. He wanted her to see the real him, even if that thought scared him beyond all comprehension. Please, Lord. He prayed spontaneously as he slowed for a corner. Please let her be okay. But, as though in reply, the sense of urgency came again. He drove even faster. He should have sent an officer to check on her earlier. Insisted she stay at his mother's, where she wouldn't be alone. She was a witness to a murder, and that placed her in danger. Although she thought the killer hadn't seen her clearly enough to identify her, she could easily be wrong. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced she was in acute danger. As he turned onto her street, his worst fears were realized. A black sedan with frosted windows was parked outside her house. 2 men with balaclavas on and weapons drawn jumped out of the vehicle and ran up her front path. They didn't bother to knock. One of them shot the front door open before they both ran in. Rob's heart pounded as his adrenaline spiked. His first instinct was to leap out of the car and tackle the men himself, but his years of training took over. It would be a foolish move. Although he was armed, he was outnumbered against 2 obviously dangerous criminals, and if shots were fired, Emma could be hurt, or worse. His stomach lurched as he screeched to a halt behind the sedan and radioed his partner Jerry. 2 masked armed men entering Emma Humphrey's house. Forced entry. Send immediate backup. He paused, then barked. I'm going in. He wouldn't wait for backup. She'd be dead before they arrived. He pulled his police issue gun out of his dashboard compartment and jumped out of the car, heart in mouth. He prayed he wasn't too late. Chapter 1. 2 weeks earlier. Rob tried his best to look interested as Marion described her day to him. Not that she was uninteresting. Not at all. In fact, her job at the dog grooming salon probably came with a lot of entertaining anecdotes, but his mind was on other things. He and his partner Jerry had taken a call from police headquarters in Melbourne earlier that day, warning them of possible drug gangs moving in on the Eastbrooke area, and Rob was eager to start investigating. His last 3 cases as one of Eastbrooke's most respected law enforcement officers had involved a missing cat, a stolen bicycle, and an ongoing feud between neighbours. Eastbrooke was a small, quiet town, and while it was a wonderful place to live, nothing much happened on a daily basis. The last major drama, over a year ago now, had involved an attempted kidnapping and a police chase in the middle of a bushfire, the same bushfire that had endangered his brother Max's life. He just couldn't seem to find a happy medium. Helping to take down a drug ring could be just what his career needed, and this time there was no chance of it getting personal. After the bushfire, Rob had found himself obsessively checking on his mother and 3 brothers, suddenly aware of their mortality after nearly losing his older brother. His vigilance had only served to annoy everyone, particularly Max, who, as the oldest, had always been the protector and had no wish to see their sibling roles suddenly reversed. Rob became aware of Marion looking at him expectantly, clearly wanting a response to something she'd just said, which he'd completely missed. He flashed her his best smile and hid his discomfort. His heart simply wasn't in this date, but he was too much of a gentleman to say so. The smile seemed to placate her, as she blushed and smiled and carried on talking. He did his best to focus, but something was wrong. He enjoyed the company of women, but he was 29 years old and hadn't had a steady relationship since his girlfriend in college. They'd broken up when she realized he wasn't about to propose any time soon, and as Christians, their relationship had nowhere else to go. It had been an amicable split, and he'd secretly been somewhat relieved, although his mother Jean had been disappointed. For years she'd despaired of having any of her 4 boys happily settled, although now, since Max had married and was expecting his first child, she'd stopped hinting at Rob. This date, though, had been her idea. His mum was friends with Marion's mother. She seemed to know everyone in Eastbrooke, and had passed the word on that Marion had her eye on Rob. "Why don't you take her for a nice meal?" his mother had suggested. "I haven't seen you date anyone in months." "That's because you told me to stop dating all the eligible young women in town if I only intended on leading them up the garden path and not to an altar," or words to that effect. She'd shaken her head with such a look of patient perseverance that he'd agreed to take Marion out. He knew he was handsome, and as an up-and-coming law enforcement officer, was considered a good catch. And he wasn't in any way disrespectful to women. He prided himself on being the perfect gentleman, and had never slept around. But at some point, most of the pretty girls in Eastbrooke had been on a date with him, until he'd sworn off after a lecture from his mum. But now it seemed she was encouraging him again. He told himself that he simply hadn't found the one, but to be honest, he wasn't really looking. His job kept him busy, and he was chasing promotion. He loved his family and saw as much of them as he could. He didn't have time for anything serious. Or, at least, that's what he told himself. If there were other, more deep-seated reasons for his reluctance to settle down, well, he wasn't the introspective type. "Are we having dessert?" Marion asked. "Sure." He smiled generously. "Order whatever you'd like." "Oh, but I'm watching my weight," she pouted. He fought not to roll his eyes. "Okay, shall we get the bill?" She looked disappointed. "I thought we could share. This cheesecake looks great." "Sure," he said again, giving his usual easygoing smile. He glanced at the clock. 20 more minutes and he could take her home, then call Jerry to talk about the information they'd received that day. His work phone buzzed in his pocket. "Sorry, I need to take this." She gave a nod. He retrieved it quickly from his pocket. Jerry's name flashed on the screen. Pressing the green button, he glanced at Marion before saying, "Hey partner, what's doing?" "Are you busy?" Jerry's gruff tones came over the line. "Sort of. What's up?" "We need you down at Jacob's Creek. We've got a body." Rob's brows hiked. Swiveling around, he kept his voice low. "A drowning?" The creek was small and not very deep. It seemed unlikely. "Nope. The dude's been shot." Rob whistled under his breath. "I'll be there as soon as I can." He cut the line and smiled apologetically at Marion. "I'm so sorry, but I have to go. Work emergency. I'll drop you home." She looked both disappointed and curious. Before she could question him, he turned and signalled for the bill. He drove her home, his mind on Jerry's news. A shooting? In Eastbrooke? Did it have anything to do with the drug smuggling ring? although such a thing seemed unthinkable in this sleepy, out-of-the-way, picturesque town. It wouldn't be the first time over the years. Eastbrooke was nestled beneath a mountain range, and plenty of passes led to the coast. It was a smuggler's dream. "Is it serious? The call-out, I mean?" Marion asked as they pulled up outside her apartment. "I can't say, but yes, it's definitely urgent." He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel as she opened the door, his head already on the shooting. Why was she taking so long to get out? She looked at him expectantly. "So I'll see you again?" He went to agree, but then his natural honesty came to the fore. "I couldn't really say now. It looks like I'm going to be pretty busy." "Well, goodbye then." She pushed the door and climbed out. He gave a half smile. "Bye, Marion." "It's Marla." Her voice was as cold as ice. She slammed the door and stormed off. Rob winced as he pulled away from the curb. This date had been a bad idea from the beginning. Now he had offended a perfectly nice woman who deserved a more attentive companion, and his mother would be disappointed. Hopefully when Max and Jania had the baby, she'd forget about his non-existent love life. He hightailed it to the creek. Romance he knew little about, but crime, that was a totally different story. It was right up his alley. When he arrived, Jerry hurried to the car, his face grim. "What took you so long?" Rob grimaced. "A date my mother set up." Jerry shook his head and let out a small chuckle. "Forensics got here quick." Rob jumped out of the vehicle and nodded towards the tent set up by the side of the creek. "Yeah, quicker than you." "Come on, give me a break." Rob let out an exasperated breath, although he knew his partner was only toying with him. "Sorry, you know I don't mean it. Come on." Jerry led him to the side of the creek where the body had been dragged out and was now being examined by the forensics expert. "What do we know?" Rob asked. "Shot to the back of the head at close range. This wasn't a crime of passion then," he said, raising his brows. "That's an execution. Do you think this could be related to the drugs line that Melbourne warned us about?" "Let's not jump to conclusions," Jerry replied. It was a familiar pattern between them, and one of the reasons they worked well together. Rob went on instinct and tended to think creatively, while Jerry was more cautious. He was a solid police officer, but it was Rob whom everyone knew was on the fast track for promotion. He'd been told numerous times that he reminded everyone of his father, George Carlton, who'd been police chief in Eastbrooke until his premature death when Rob was 13. "Looks likely though, doesn't it?" Rob continued. "Was he killed here, or did the creek carry him down?" They were at the creek now, and he addressed his last question to the forensics expert, an older woman with a steel grey bob. "Killed here," she confirmed. "He's been dead at least 12 hours, I'd say. So sometime in the early hours." "Let's get search and rescue on the lookout for a weapon," Jerry said. Rob nodded, although he doubted they'd find one. "I'll call Joseph and get him and his team onto it." "Is Johnson coming?" Al Johnson was the current police chief in Eastbrooke, nearing retirement and fast losing enthusiasm for the job. "I called him," Jerry replied. "He was on a weekend break with his wife, but he's on his way back now." Rob frowned. "I don't suppose he was happy about that." "You suppose right." The pair exchanged a wry smile, and then Rob got on the radio. Joseph was his younger brother who headed mountain rescue, whereas Eli, the youngest, was also on the police force. At 24, he was their newest recruit, eager and bright. When he'd announced his intention to sign up, Rob had been worried about future rivalry, but Eli was intent on moving to the city once he'd served his time here. Rob studied the bloated body. Who was he? How had he ended up here? "Nothing to identify him?" Jerry shook his head as his phone rang. He took the call, and after a few moments of nodding and the odd word here and there, he faced Rob. "That was the chief." "I figured that much. What did he want?" "Seems you might be right." He spoke to Melbourne, An informant told them a gang member called Jose Marino had been kidnapped by a rival gang, the same one they believe is moving in on the mountains. There's been a feud brewing for a while, it seems. Rob's adrenaline kicked up a notch. Why had he ever complained about Eastbrooke being boring? Why kill him all the way out here? Jerry scratched his head of thick brown hair. To send a message. Rob instinctively knew he was right. It's a way of saying, this is our territory now. Jerry shook his head. I hope you're wrong. This can't be happening in Eastbrooke. Nothing like this has happened here since your father's day. Yeah, Rob said, his voice like flint. And it killed him. Jerry shuddered. Sorry, mate. That was insensitive. Not at all, but let's pray this gets cleaned up quickly. Jerry nodded. Rob's gaze swung to the mountain towering above like a silent sentinel, and then to the body. A tremor ran through him. No, this wasn't going to get cleaned up quickly. Don't ask how he knew. He just knew. Chapter 2. Emma glanced at the clock and was surprised that it was nearly time to go home. The day had flown, but then she adored her job as a first-grade teacher at Eastbrooke Primary. After qualifying as a teacher, she'd rejoined her parents at their missionary camp and taught in the small school in the compound. She'd loved it, but the poverty and harsh conditions broke her heart. It had been a life-changing experience, and she'd expected it would be the sort of work she'd always do, having grown up with missionary parents. However, while home on a trip to see her grandparents, an advertisement for a first-grade teacher at Eastbrooke Primary caught her eye. She felt God calling her to answer it. Her parents urged her to follow that call, and so here she was. Living and working in the small and peaceful town of Eastbrooke was a huge change from Ethiopia, and she sometimes wondered how long it would be before she grew restless. It wasn't the type of place where much happened, which is why, she supposed, the news article that appeared yesterday about the body of an unknown man found in Jacob's Creek had caused quite a stir and had been the talk of the town ever since. The consensus was that it must have been an accident, perhaps an unlucky camper who didn't know the mountains well, although there was a rumour it had been a murder. Emma had been in Eastbrooke for 3 months, and had found it a welcoming place, having made good friends with her colleagues and the women from the local church, especially Jean Carlton, an older woman with a nurturing manner that reminded Emma of her own mother. Jean was a well-loved figure in the local community, ran the women's group at Eastbrooke Baptist Church, and had taken Emma under her wing and helped her feel at home. Jean was a widow with 4 grown sons, and she treated Emma like the daughter she never had.
Miss?
Josie, a cute blue-eyed 5-year-old with golden braids, looked up from her drawing.
Robbie's stolen the red crayon. I had it first,
Robbie pouted. Josie promptly picked up the green crayon and scribbled all over Robbie's picture, to which Robbie let out a huge yell. Emma was about to intervene when the bell sounded. Relieved, she reprimanded them both gently, helped the children pack up, and then saw them out. She was doing a last-minute tidy of the classroom when her colleague Mary came in and asked, "Will you be at church next Sunday?" "Of course," Emma smiled. "A few of us are going for a walk afterwards if you'd like to come. We're thinking of making it a regular thing." "Oh, I'm going to Jean Carlton's for lunch this Sunday, but I'll definitely come the week after. I love a good walk, and a regular walking club sounds like a great idea." "Great, I'll sign you up," Mary said on her way out, leaving Emma smiling after her. Mary was always trying to sign her up to something. Last week it had been crochet club, which Emma had tried, only to discover she was terrible at it. She locked up and left, saying goodbye to the caretaker on the way out. It was a bright, sunny day, and she decided to walk the kilometre home, practically the entire length of Eastbrooke, rather than waiting for the bus, which was unreliable at the best of times. She was halfway down High Street when Rob Carlton approached from the opposite direction. She knew who he was because she was friends with his mum, and she'd met him at church. She'd heard the rumours about him being some sort of playboy, and had to admit, he cut a dashing figure in his police uniform. She felt her cheeks warm when he smiled at her. She wasn't immune to his good looks, but he wasn't her type. Not that she had a type. A life devoted to missionary work had never left time for romance. But her type definitely wasn't a man like him. Not that he wasn't a good man. The town held him in high regard, and he was evidently a good police officer. On the few occasions she'd spoken to him, he'd been unfailingly polite, but he also had a reputation as the town's most eligible bachelor. His easy confidence suggested he was aware of his charms. She'd always thought of herself as something of a plain Jane, and certainly not the glamorous type someone like him would choose to be with. "Hello, Emma, isn't it?" he asked politely as they reached each other. "Yes, from the school," she said, lowering her gaze. She'd only ever spoken briefly to him when they'd been in a crowd at church, and never alone. "Eastbrooke Primary's a great school. All of us Carlton boys went there, as did my mum and dad." "Wow, that's really lovely you have roots like that." She lifted her gaze, suddenly wistful. As a result of her parents' travelling, she'd gone to 5 different schools and been homeschooled throughout her adolescence. She wouldn't have changed the experience for the world. But even so, the sense of belonging Rob described painted a touching picture. "You've come from Africa, haven't you?" he asked. His interest momentarily flattered her, but then she reminded herself that he was the type of guy who could make anyone feel he was interested in them. Not in a deliberate sense, but just because of his natural charm and easy manner. She gave a nod. "Yes, Ethiopia. I worked at a missionary school my parents set up. I'm Melbourne born and bred, though. My grandparents still live there." "I'd love to do more travelling. I've been to New Zealand, but that's about it. You must have loads of stories." "A few," she agreed, smiling. "You'll have to tell me about them sometime." A charming grin hitched up the side of his face, sending an involuntary tingle up her spine. Before she could reply, he was on his way. She huffed with annoyance as she stared after him. How dare he have that effect on her? Chiding herself, she hoisted her bag onto her shoulder, and lifting her chin, continued on her way. She had more important things to worry about than Rob Carlton. What to have for dinner, for one. Her turn-of-the-century 2-bedroom cottage was on a lovely, leafy lane, surrounded by other similar cottages. Colourful annuals filled her front garden. Not that she was a gardener. Far from it. But her nan had given her some tips when she first moved in. And now, the whole garden looked really pretty. Smiling, she headed to the front door and went inside. Quickly changing into sweatpants and a tank top, she contemplated making a casserole for dinner before deciding against it, and instead put a ready-made meal for one in the oven. She had a lot of lesson planning to do, and didn't have the patience for cooking. She'd bought a stack of ready-made meals last week for evenings like this. As she put it in the oven, she recalled the pitying look on the shopkeeper's face as he'd rung them through the till. "A young lady like you shouldn't be on her own," he'd said kindly. "I'm sure you'll meet someone soon." "I'm not actually looking for anyone," she'd mumbled, thrusting her shopping into her recyclable bag and hurrying off, mortified. She was only 26, not quite a spinster yet. Even so, the last 2 times they'd spoken on the phone, her mother had asked if she'd met any nice men in Eastbrooke. "Mum," she'd protested, "I'm not planning on staying here forever." "Well, you were led there for a reason," her mother said, "and I do worry that mine and your father's lifestyle has meant you've missed out." "I've had a wonderful life," Emma said sincerely. "Stop worrying. Things will happen in God's time. Isn't that what you always tell me?" As she tucked into her meal for one, half an hour later, she thought that even so, a date might be nice. Unbidden, the face of Rob Carlton came to mind. She quickly pushed the image away. She didn't know him well, but he definitely wasn't her type. After finishing her lesson plans and having a hot bath, she climbed into bed and opened her Bible. She'd been prayerfully reading through the Psalms, and her eyes alighted on Psalm 61. She slowly and mindfully read it aloud. "Hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer. From the ends of the earth I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Lead me to the rock which is higher than I. For you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you, God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name." She paused, allowing the beautiful words to sink into her heart and soul before praying silently, in thanks, and for her parents and her students. She also added a prayer for the family of the man whose body had been found in the creek. As she drifted off to sleep, her thoughts once again shifted to Rob, but this time in his capacity as a protector of the town. She trembled as she remembered the rumours about the body, which meant Rob might be hunting a murderer. "Keep him safe, Lord," she murmured sleepily before she fell into a deep, undisturbed sleep. Chapter 3. Lewis stifled a shudder under Eric's glare, his boss's eyes hard, like shards of ice. Lewis had seen the consequences of that look once too often. Any sign of weakness would be a further sign of failure, and his boss didn't tolerate failure. He paid well, but the cost of letting him down was higher, much higher. "I told you," Eric said slowly, as though speaking to a disobedient 3-year-old, "to send a message to the gang in Melbourne and take care of both Jose and Rick. Instead, you let Rick get away and leave Jose's body where it could be found." Lewis bit his tongue while considering how best to reply. It was pointless saying that Eric's instructions had been less than clear. He had a brilliant criminal mind, but he expected everyone else to read it and keep up with his unscrupulous schemes without the need to spell them out. He was impossible to please, and in Lewis's line of work, that did not bode well for a long life. "By send a message, I assumed you wanted the body found," Lewis said in a matter-of-fact tone. Pleading wouldn't get him anywhere with Eric. "No, Lewis, I meant send evidence of his death to our rivals in Melbourne. Oh, I don't know, a body part or two? Not leave his body floating in a creek, alerting the small town hicks of Eastbrooke to our presence here in the mountains. And how did Rick get away?" He angled his head slowly, his gaze boring into Lewis. Lewis swallowed. It was his fault. He'd assumed he could handle both executions by himself. It had never occurred to him that Rick might put up a fight, cutting him in the process. Lewis knew better than to tell Eric he'd sustained a knife wound to his side that he'd stitched up himself. "I did injure him," Lewis said, effectively dodging the question. "He's probably dead somewhere in the mountains by now." Eric's eyes blazed. He leaned forward, his voice low. It was more like a snake hissing than a soothing murmur. "But you don't know that for sure, do you? You've left us vulnerable, Lewis." Lewis hung his head, hoping that the contrition would be enough. He was Eric's right-hand man, and Eric kept his team small, especially as he had a penchant for eliminating non-performers. "Tell me what I need to do," he said, his gaze fixed to the floor, his heart beating in his throat. Eric's gaze was on him. He could feel it. He'd be lucky to get out of this alive. Finally, Eric's chair creaked. Lewis lifted his gaze slowly, holding his breath. "Get people looking for the body, if there is one," Eric ordered in a tone that suggested if there wasn't, there'd be an unpleasant consequence for Lewis. "Done," Lewis said with as much confidence as he could muster. Eric drummed his fingers on the arm of the chair. "What do we know about the police in Eastbrooke? Are they just small-town hicks, or do we need to worry about how far they'll investigate Jose's death? And how likely are we to term one of them as an informant?" "Not very," Lewis replied, answering his boss's last question. "These small-town cops aren't as jaded as those in the city." Eric narrowed his eyes. "There's something you're not telling me." "No," Lewis said hurriedly. Probably too hurriedly. He swallowed hard. "It's just that—" "What?" Eric snapped again. "The chief here's getting old and he's taken his eye off the ball. He couldn't catch us if he tried, but it might be wise to keep an eye on the officer below him." Eric cocked a brow. "What's the officer's name?" "Robert Carlton. His father, George Carlton, was the old chief, well respected in the town. I wasn't able to dig up any dirt on him. He seems to be clean." "Carlton," Eric mused, scratching his chin. "Why have I heard that name before?" "George Carlton was blown up in an explosion 15 years ago that was believed to have been linked to a white supremacist cell, the White Legion. There's a rumor they've started up again." Lewis studied Eric's face closely. His boss had youthful links to white supremacists, but his expression betrayed no recognition. From what Lewis had gleaned, his boss had never been overly involved. He was more focused on criminality, power, and profit than serving any ideology that didn't benefit him. Eric tapped the arm of the chair again. "No, I'm thinking more recent. The son, Rob. Why does his name sound significant?" "He was the cop that caught that gang leader up here last year." The removal of that leader had allowed Eric and his men to encroach on the weaker successor's turf. Jose and Rick had been a part of that gang. Eric was now one step closer to achieving his goal of dominating the drug trade in Australia. And not just drugs. The mountain passes offered opportunities for other, even more lucrative cargo. But Eric didn't seem impressed. He shrugged. "Sounds like he just got lucky. Rob Carlton won't be a threat, and if he is, well, you know what to do." Chapter 4. Rob beat his horn outside his mother's house. Moments later, the front door opened and she came out, dressed in a neat floral dress and cardigan, her plump face full of smiles as she hurried down the path towards the car. He was driving her to church, and today he was looking forward to going. It had been a busy week at work, and he craved the quiet of Eastbrooke Baptist Church, which always gave him a sense of peace, even if he didn't always understand what the minister was talking about, mainly because he had a tendency to zone out and think about other things. He had faith, although he was aware it had come easily to him since he'd grown up in the church. He'd never really questioned it, or wrestled with it, or felt a need to look deeper. He believed because he was brought up to believe, and as far as he was concerned, that was good enough. He did his best to be a good man and live by solid principles, which was surely the important thing. His mother and younger brother, Joseph, were devout enough for the rest of them. Although his oldest brother, Max, had recommitted to his faith after meeting his wife the year before. Eli, the youngest, seemed more rebellious and was seen at church increasingly rarely these days, greatly concerning to both his mother and Joseph. His mum reached the car and slid into the passenger seat before enveloping him in a big hug.
"Morning, son."
"No, Eli." Rob lifted his brow. At 24, Eli was the only Carlton brother still living at home.
"No,"
she said with a sigh.
"He's gone fishing with his friend Scott."
Her face showed clearly how she felt about her youngest son skipping church to do his own thing yet again. "You can't make him come, Mum," Rob said softly but firmly. "You'll only make him more hostile. This is something he has to figure out for himself." She huffed out an exasperated sigh as she stared out the window.
"I know, I just worry about him. He's always been the most sensitive of you all.
And I worry his grief over your father has turned into a big ball of resentment that he just won't address. He was so young when it happened. I think it affected him more than I realized at the time." Rob patted his mother's hand before starting the engine. "He knows we're all here for him, Mum, and honestly, I think you worry too much. He's doing great at work."
"Chasing murderers."
Her tone left no question about how she felt about that. Rob suppressed a smile. His mother often wished her sons had chosen regular, safe occupations. Instead, she had 2 police officers, a mountain search and rescue expert, and a wilderness guide. No wonder she was always worried. "Well, Eastbrooke doesn't get very many of them," he said. "This week has been most unusual, but we'll get to the bottom of it." He didn't tell her about the possible links with organised crime in Melbourne. That was the last thing she needed to know. They were halfway to church before she mentioned his ill-fated date with Marion. Whoops, Marla.
"So I take it you haven't spoken to Marla since your date?"
"She's a lovely girl," he said diplomatically. "But I'm really not looking for anyone, Mum. And especially right now, with a case like this taking up my time. If I get to the bottom of it, it could be my chance to get promoted. It's always been my dream to follow in Dad's footsteps. You know that." Her face softened as she touched his wrist.
"I know. And he would have been so proud of you. Of all of you. I just want to see you settled and happy. Life can't be all about work. Your father was one of the most hard-working men I knew, but it didn't stop him being a family man."
She was right. His dad had been the best. If he could be half the policeman and family man he'd been, Rob would be happy. But he didn't want his mother matchmaking. He'd hoped that with Max about to give her the first Carlton grandchild, she'd ease up on him, but it didn't seem she had.
"There's a wonderful young woman I think you'd get along with," she continued.
He groaned audibly. "Mum, no more!"
"You already know her,"
she continued, regardless of his protestations.
"Emma, that lovely new teacher from the primary school."
"I saw her the other day," he said quietly. He kept his gaze glued to the road, sensing his mother's gaze on him.
"You like her?"
"She seems very nice, yes," he said neutrally. "Shall we have the radio on?" As he drove and his mother mercifully started singing along to the local gospel station, he thought about Emma Humphreys. Or rather, tried not to think about her. His mother was right. He did like her, although he couldn't put his finger on what it was about her that he felt drawn to. She was attractive, but hers was a quiet beauty that she made little effort to adorn. She was always neat and well presented, but unlike most young women her age, she seemed to have little interest in her appearance and always looked demure. Perhaps it went with the teacher image, or the fact that she'd spent most of her life on a mission in Ethiopia with her parents, a fact he knew through his mother. With those kind of priorities, he supposed hair and makeup took a back seat. Nevertheless, there was a quiet dignity about her and a self-sufficiency that he found intriguing and made him want to get to know her. Except, he felt an uncharacteristic pang of shyness whenever he bumped into her. Perhaps precisely because she stood out so much. No doubt his mother would continue trying to set them up, and although he didn't dislike the idea of dating her, it made him nervous. He'd always thought of himself as a confident person, yet he felt somehow inferior compared to Emma. She needed someone better than him, and better Christian, for a start.
"Oh, look, there she is,"
his mother announced gaily as they pulled up outside the small church. Emma stood at the entrance, chatting to the meet and greeter, dressed in a simple shift dress and flat pumps, with her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked effortlessly pretty. He climbed out of the car and walked with his mum towards the church, and Emma. When she lifted her head and caught sight of them, her eyes widened as her gaze briefly met his. She quickly directed it to his mother and gave her a smile. The pair embraced warmly.
"Emma's coming for lunch with us after church, Rob,"
his mother said with a grin. His head snapped up, and he stared wide-eyed at her before he pasted on a smile and turned to Emma. "How lovely." She returned his smile with an equally fake one. Ushering his mother inside, he left Emma to continue her chat. Eastbrooke Baptist Church was an old stone building that dated back to some of the early settlers, and the simple altars and pews stood in contrast to the impressive stonework and pretty stained glass windows depicting frolicking angels. There was a sense of peace in the old building that soothed Rob as soon as he entered, and he followed his mother into a pew near the front, where Joseph, Max and Jania were already seated. Jania was 5 months pregnant, and her belly swelled against her loose cotton trousers. Rob grinned as he kissed her cheek. "How's my little nephew doing?" Jania laughed. "Rob, you know we've opted not to know the sex." "The Carltons run to boys," he told her. "Look at us."
"I'd love a granddaughter,"
his mother said wistfully.
"Although, of course, the child will be loved regardless of what gender it happens to be."
"She's already bought a stack of pink onesies," Rob whispered. Jania laughed, and then the organist began to play. They stood to sing a traditional hymn, "How Great Thou Art," before a young woman with an acoustic guitar got up to do a more modern version of In Christ Alone. Rob sang along, and for once he found himself reflecting on the words which were, he realized, quite beautiful. "In Christ alone my strength is found. He is my light, my strength, my song." As he absorbed the music, he felt a sudden pang of gratitude for all that he had. His family, his church. He'd always had the privilege of feeling grounded and protected, although losing his father so young had of course been devastating. He'd always known he was loved. His thoughts flashed to the body in the creek, who'd now been formally identified as Jose Ingala, a drug dealer from Melbourne. What had gone wrong in the man's life that he'd ended up like this? Although he wasn't someone likely to garner much public sympathy, he was still someone's son, someone's brother, perhaps even someone's husband. Regardless of what he'd done and whatever had caused him to be killed, Rob vowed he'd do whatever was needed to bring his killer to justice. After all, that was why he'd chosen to be a policeman. His dad had talked a lot about justice to his young sons, and about how man's justice would always be fallible. Many would say that Jose had gotten the justice his life had deserved, but Rob knew what his mother would say about that. God weeps for every lost soul. A shiver went up his spine. He glanced up at the sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows and grew mesmerized. So much so that he barely realized when the singing was over and Max nudged him to sit. The minister read out the week's notices and then began his sermon. He was a small, elderly man with a commanding presence, and his voice carried across the small church, capturing the attention of his congregation. Rather than allow his thoughts to drift as he usually did, Rob listened as the minister began by reading a passage from the letter of Paul to the church in Ephesus, known as Ephesians. "As for you, you are dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved, and God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Jesus Christ, in order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace, expressed in his kindness to us in Jesus Christ. For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Although Rob had heard this passage many times before, he'd never really stopped to ponder its meaning. When the minister began to preach, talking about what it meant to be saved by grace alone, Rob leaned forward, taking in every word, although it felt uncomfortably like each one was directed straight at him. "Paul is telling us," the minister said, his gaze momentarily landing on Rob, "that no matter how good our works, or how righteous we think we are, none of this saves us. We are saved only by the grace of God. Christ alone is our salvation. We can't work our way to heaven." Rob sat very still. How had he missed this? He had always assumed that because he was from a good, church-going family and he tried to live a good life and do good works, he'd earned his place in heaven. He was one of the good guys. He'd always assumed that was enough, and he didn't have to worry about forgiveness or salvation in the way that someone like Jose, for example, would. Yet the minister was saying that was wrong, that Rob, as much as anyone, needed the grace of God. But if that was true, didn't it mean all his arduous work had been for nothing? Once again, the minister spoke as though answering his very thoughts. "Of course, this doesn't mean that works are not vital to God's kingdom. We're commanded to live as Christ told us, and James says, 'Faith without works is dead.' But we can't get to faith, or grace, by works. Rather, it's God's grace that inspires us to do good works, for His glory. For any good works we do for our own glory are surely the works of a hypocrite. For Jesus himself tells us in the Gospel of Matthew, 'Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven.' Yet how many of us take pride in our own righteousness?" The minister's strong words had Rob reeling. He sat back in his pew, hardly able to grasp what he was hearing. Everything he'd taken for granted, all his categories about who the good guys and bad guys were, was being completely upended. How on earth had he managed to come to church all his life and never understood this? He glanced over at his mother and brothers to see if they too looked shocked. But they were nodding along happily, clearly familiar with the message. "We must remember," the minister concluded, his voice softer, "that we are all sinners. By God's grace alone we are saved, and that this is good news. Let us pray." As the minister prayed aloud, Rob bowed his head and prayed silently, his heart filled with remorse. "Lord, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure how I missed this, and I'm not sure I understand it all, but I want to. I want to know more about you. More about your grace. More about Jesus. I don't want to be self-righteous or proud. Help me to know you better, Lord." The service ended with another song, and then everyone moved out of the church, shaking hands and chatting, but he felt disorientated. Joseph studied him, frowning. "You okay, brother?" "I think so," Rob replied uncertainly. "That sermon really got to me." Joseph clapped him on the back. "I've got to go, but call me during the week. We'll talk about it." "Thank you." As Joseph left, his mother approached with Emma in tow.
"Emma can come in your car with us, can't she, Rob?"
she asked, her eyes twinkling. Blinking, he replied, "Of course." Chapter 5. Emma felt strange and awkward sitting in the back of Rob's car as he drove his mother and her to Jean's house for lunch after church. He was quiet, his usual easy smile replaced by a reflective, faraway look which she assumed was because of the body discovered in the creek. The local press had been reporting on it all week, obviously excited at something sensational to print. The whole of Eastbrooke was talking about the tragedy, to the point that some of her pupils had raised the topic in class, having heard the adults around them discussing it. She'd done her best to reassure the little ones that the police would catch the bad guys, and not to worry. Luckily, smaller children were resilient and easily distracted, especially when she'd allowed them to get the modelling clay out in an effort to do just that. Today, though, the idea that anything bad could happen in Eastbrooke seemed surreal. The sun was out, the service that morning had soothed her soul, and Jean chatted away happily as they headed to her house. She lived in a detached, white brick home with a huge bay window and large front and back gardens. It was the same house Jean had raised her 4 boys in with her husband.
"Joseph sends his apologies,"
Jean said, turning her head slightly.
"but he had to dash off to work straight after church. I hoped Eli would be here, but he's gone fishing, so it's just us, Max and Jania."
"Oh, lovely," Emma said, pasting on a smile. That left her and Rob as the other couple. She hoped Jean wasn't playing Cupid. Her friend was eager to see all of her sons settled, so it wouldn't surprise her. Emma glanced at Rob as they walked towards the door, but he seemed miles away. Max and Jania arrived just as she was taking a seat at the table, while Jean laid out a simple cold buffet. She'd never spoken much to them. They lived a short way out of town on a resort-style ranch they ran, facilitating wilderness programs for city kids, and Max in particular wasn't very talkative. But she got on with Jania, who seemed both outgoing and kind. "How are you feeling?" Emma asked sympathetically when Jania winced while easing herself into the seat opposite. "I'm really good, actually. But just this last week I keep getting a trapped nerve. I think it's the way the baby's laying, although he or she doesn't stay in the same position for long." Emma glanced at Jania's swelling belly, wondering at the miracle of life and how it must feel to be blessed with a child in your womb.
"Do you want children, Emma?"
Jean asked, her eyes gleaming. Emma blinked and tucked a strand of loose hair behind her ear. "Oh, I suppose. I haven't given it much thought as of yet, but in the future, yes, I guess so." "Ignore her," Max said gruffly. "She's obsessed with marriage and babies. Jania and I would have a whole football team if she had her way." "Oh, goodness, no," Jania laughed. 2 or 3, maybe." She rubbed her stomach affectionately. Jean took the seat at the head of the table, leaving Rob to sit next to Emma. He smiled as he sat, seemingly having snapped out of his reflective mood, and despite herself, Emma felt her cheeks warm. His blue eyes were piercing against his tanned skin and dark hair, and she felt acutely aware of his nearness. "How's the case going, Rob?" Max asked, spearing a tomato. Rob groaned. "You know I can't talk about it, but to be honest, it isn't. As the paper has reported, the victim's from out of town, and we haven't found any local leads, so it'll probably be passed on to the city police." Max narrowed his gaze. "You're not happy about that?" Rob shrugged before taking a sip of Coke. "Just protective of my jurisdiction, I suppose. It's a cop thing."
"Your father was the same,"
Jean said.
"You're so much like him."
She squeezed his wrist and smiled. Rob pulled in a deep breath, and if Emma wasn't mistaken, a knowing look passed between the brothers. She quickly tucked into what was a very tasty lunch. She hadn't been hungry that morning and had skipped breakfast, so she felt famished now. She listened as the Carlton family chatted away, swapping stories past and present. She felt at ease with them, not like an outsider at all. It made her a little homesick for her own parents, who were a close couple and devoted to her, their only daughter. "You grew up in Africa, didn't you, Emma?" Jania asked. Emma nodded. "Ethiopia. My parents still run missionary projects there. It's a tough place to live, but it has a stark beauty, despite all the hardships. Seeing all the poverty must be difficult. Yes, it makes you grateful for what you have. Nothing gets taken for granted, and everything, where possible, is shared. I've heard some people say that such places test their faith, but it only strengthened mine." Rob looked at her with admiration. She abruptly went quiet and nibbled her sourdough roll. Oblivious, Jania continued. "It's very different, of course," she said, "but I grew up in a rough neighbourhood in Melbourne. Nobody had a lot. Of course, many people in that kind of situation turn to crime or alcohol. But on the other hand, our community church was strong. I think people often come together in the face of adversity, and that adversity can make them stronger. Max nodded. Definitely. We see it with the kids up at the ranch, although some of them can be trying. Rob threw his head back and laughed. I don't envy you, brother. I'd rather deal with a town full of criminals than a bunch of teenagers. Jania, a youth worker, rolled her eyes and chuckled. You should try 5-year-olds, Emma quipped. They're little tyrants sometimes. They all laughed as she regaled them with a couple of funny stories, and before she knew it, lunch was over and it was time to go.
Can you drop Emma off, Rob?
Jean asked. Oh, it's no trouble to walk, Emma said flustered. No, not at all. I pass Neil Street anyway, he said. She drew a slow breath and accepted the offer graciously, since it would be rude to say no. After thanking Jean for a lovely lunch and saying goodbye to Max and Jania, she walked to the car with Rob and got in the passenger side. As he slipped in beside her, she tugged a piece of hair and wrapped it around her finger. Other than bumping into him in the street, she'd never been alone with him before and suddenly felt at loss for anything to say. He, too, seemed suddenly awkward. Then, as he pulled away from the curb, he asked abruptly, What did you think of the service this morning? Her forehead creased as she faced him. She hadn't expected that question. Oh, I really enjoyed it. It's a lovely church. I'd not heard that message before. Really? His admission surprised her. After all, grace as a free gift was a cornerstone of the Christian faith, while she supposed that was second nature for her, having grown up with devout parents. The Carltons had been going to church all their lives too. It seemed he wanted to talk, so she waited for him to continue. It really got to me. He drew a slow breath and braced his hands on the wheel. All that stuff about works and self-righteousness? I've always believed that I'm a good guy as opposed to a bad guy, but it hit me this morning that I've always assumed I'm in God's good books because of the work I do. Hearing that works don't mean a thing shook me. I can definitely understand that. She gave an empathetic smile. I mean, I come from a missionary family. I grew up thinking we were good. She spread her arms wide and chuckled. Look at us saving the world. It was a while before it sunk in that only God saves. There was nothing wrong in what we were doing, but at the end of the day, we were still sinners in need of God's grace. There's real freedom in understanding that. Rob frowned. You understand it? Yes, she said lightly, not wanting to belittle him. Imagine if we did have to earn God's favour through works. The quest for perfection would be exhausting. I think many people and institutions fall into that trap. Rob nodded thoughtfully. You're right, he said after a few moments. I think I've been trying to prove something my whole life. For a long moment she studied him. He was much deeper than she'd originally thought. I imagine your job can be high pressure, she said softly. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel and looked at her. Yep, but I love it. As they pulled up outside her house, an odd twinge of disappointment that the journey was over so quickly flowed through her. She'd seen a side to him she doubted few outside his family ever saw, and she would have liked to continue their chat. Thanks for listening, he said gently as she unstrapped her seat belt. You're really easy to talk to. Not at all. I enjoyed spending time with you, she said sincerely. Perhaps we should go for a coffee sometime, maybe next weekend? A small breath escaped her lips. She wanted to say yes, but something stopped her. Although she was sure he was simply being friendly and not at all inappropriate, the gossip she'd heard about him dating every pretty girl in town ran through her mind. She didn't want to be just another girl on that list, especially when it would spread around Eastbrooke like wildfire. I'm afraid I'm busy next weekend, she said primly. I have a whole month's worth of lesson planning to do. Disappointment flashed in his eyes, but he shrugged and looked as easygoing as ever. Perhaps she'd imagined the disappointment. "No worries. I'll see you around," he said casually as she reached for the door handle. She smiled. "Sure, thanks for the ride." As he drove off, she stood on the grass and watched until his car turned a corner and disappeared from sight. Mixed feelings surged through her. Why had she turned him down? It was only coffee, not a date. And since when did she care what people thought? As much as she felt sure that her response was the right one, part of her wondered what might have happened if she'd said yes. Chapter 6. Rob arrived at work the next morning completely out of sorts. He'd slept badly, kept awake by ruminating over the minister's words and the abject humiliation of being turned down by Emma. He'd only invited her for coffee, and he'd definitely only been offering the hand of friendship, but her refusal smarted. A woman had never turned him down for a date. Never. Not, of course, that it would have been a date. It wasn't just his pride that was stinging over the rejection. He'd seen the look on her face, however fleeting, almost of disappointment, when he invited her. He couldn't stop wondering what it meant, and could only conclude that she'd thought he was being inappropriate. Perhaps Marion, no, Marla, why couldn't he get her name right, had said something. Small-town gossip was rife, and for once he felt resentful of his reputation as a charmer. For some reason he wasn't prepared to look at too deeply. He wanted Emma to think more highly of him. Coupled with the revelation the minister's words had given him, he had the distinct sense that his entire world-view, not least of himself, had just been upended. He was eager to start on a new week at the station. As a cop, he knew where he was and what he was doing. After entering the building, a stone construction as old as the town, he made a beeline for the kitchen to grab a coffee. But as he passed through the open-plan work area, Jerry looked up and asked, "Hey, Rob, did Johnson call you about this morning?" Pausing, Rob shook his head. "No, what about this morning?" "Joseph found a guy hiding on the mountain. He was picked up and brought into custody a few hours ago. Same gang tattoos as our friend Jose. He had some minor injuries, so he was taken to the hospital. Eli's on guard." Rob shook the fog from his head. He needed to focus. "Have we contacted Melbourne?" Jerry grinned. "I thought you might want to question him yourself first. If something's going on in those passes, it's our jurisdiction as much as the heavies, and you've got a knack for getting answers." Feeling much more himself, Rob nodded eagerly. "I'll grab a coffee and we'll go and question him. Do we know his name?" "Not yet. He's refusing to say, but we know Jose ran with a guy named Rick, and our man matches his description." "Has the boss got him pegged as the killer?" Jerry shrugged. "I think Johnson considers the whole thing a nuisance. He wants a nice, easy couple of years before his retirement, but Joseph said the guy seemed almost relieved when he was picked up. He was scared, but not of being brought in." "Then he was a target as well," Rob said, taking a deep breath. "And he most likely knows who killed Jose. Getting him to tell us will be the hard part. Forget the coffee. Let's go." As they strode into the hospital 15 minutes later, Rob was pumped. He wanted to nail this case. It was his chance to prove he was the right choice for the police chief when Johnson retired, and to follow in his father's footsteps. God's grace might not need to be earned, but promotions sure did. His brother Eli stood outside the room where the suspect was being kept. He'd been on the night shift and looked both tired and relieved to see Rob and Jerry. "How's our guy?" Jerry asked. "Not saying much, but polite enough with the hospital staff. Refusing to say a word to me, of course." "He'll talk to Rob," Jerry said confidently. Rob hoped his partner was right. The man, whom they assumed was Rick, lay back on the pillows with his arm in a sling, heavy set with a shaved head. All visible parts of his body, including his head, were covered in gang markings. He narrowed his eyes as the pair entered the room and stood at the end of his bed. I'm not telling you anything, he spat. We haven't even said hello yet, Jerry said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. Rob sat on the other side with his arms folded. Hey, Rick. The guy flinched, then glared at him, not acknowledging his name. His reaction said it all, though. They had the right guy. Now they needed him to talk. You're a long way from your usual territory, Rob said amiably, almost with disinterest. He was examining his fingernails and could have been talking about the weather, a tactic that seemed to rile a suspect, playing to their ego. Someone like Rick wanted other men to know he was important and someone to be reckoned with. Sensing the guy glaring at him, Rob yawned, stretched his hands behind his head, and looked around the room. You don't know what you're talking about, Rick snarled. No? Rob quirked a brow. No, you're just a small-town hick. You think you can do better than those Flash City cops? They've never managed to catch us. Rob gave an easy smile, and Rick clamped his mouth shut. He'd said too much, and he knew it. Someone called Jose, though, Jerry chimed in. Rick folded his arms across his chest, or at least tried to, given his wounds. I don't know what you're talking about. That's what you just said about us, Rob said. We're going to be here for a while if you don't know. And I don't know. And Jerry here doesn't know. Jerry, want to go grab some coffees? Looks like we need to get comfortable. Let the officer outside know he can go home. Sure. Jerry stood and left the room. Rob started whistling under his breath, still leaning back in his chair. Rick glared at him. You guys think this is funny? Think what's funny, Rick? Rob leaned forward, still smiling, but his tone had changed. The fact you're in hospital? Obviously a wanted man? Or the fact the same person who killed your friend and put you in here is up to no good in my area? Actually, I think neither of those things are funny. Like you said, I'm a small-town cop. I like an easy life. I don't like bodies washing up in my jurisdiction, upsetting everybody. He paused. Rick continued glaring at him, his dark eyes wild. The way I see it, Rob continued, you have two choices. You don't tell me what you know, and I turn you over to Melbourne, who no doubt will have warrants out for your arrest. Or you do tell me what you know, and then I turn you over to Melbourne. Rick frowned. That makes no sense. Why would I talk if there's nothing in it for me? Because you might just be our star witness. And star witnesses can make bargains. You might even stay out of jail. Get a new name, start again. I'm no snitch. He turned his head away. Rob shrugged and sat back again, folding his arms. Okay, then I can't help you. Take your chances with Melbourne, and whoever's after you. Rick closed his eyes, wincing with a pain that Rob guessed was caused by more than just his arm. When he opened them again, they were dark with fear. Rick was scared of whoever had shot him and killed Jose. But scared or not, he was no greener behind the ears than Rob. He narrowed his eyes and sneered. You forgot the third option. Which is? I walk out of here. I don't see no arrest warrant. That's right, Rob said amiably. Because we're not arresting you. Yet. We're just asking you a few friendly questions. And if you're the fine, upstanding citizen I'm sure you want to be, you'll cooperate. I want a lawyer. Rick's mouth took on an unpleasant twist. Why would you want a lawyer, Rick? Like I said, we're just asking you a few questions. You don't need a lawyer for that. I don't know anyone called Rick. Rob raised a brow. Let's cut the pretense, okay? You're not being recorded. I know who you are. And I don't care what you got up to in Melbourne. I do care about Jose's body washing up in Jacobs Creek, and the implications of that for my town. This is a lovely place, a good place. We don't have organized crime around here. Rick snorted. Tell that to your father. Rob stiffened, a chill going down his spine. What? He said, enunciating each word carefully. "Do you know about my father?" Rick lay back on the pillows and turned his head away. "Nothing. I'm tired. I need to rest. I'll tell the nurses you're harassing me." "The nurses will do whatever Rob tells them," Jerry quipped, stepping back into the room carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Officer Carlton is Eastbrooke's most eligible bachelor. Isn't that right, Officer Carlton?" Jerry winked as he handed him his coffee. Rob took the polystyrene cup without the smile and joke Jerry was expecting. Emma flashed into his mind, but he pushed away her image. Not now. He wanted to know why Rick had mentioned his father, because there was a reason, and instinct told him it was related to this case. "You mentioned my father," he said coldly. "Let's cut the bull, Rick. This is off the record, okay? For now, anyway. Why would you know anything about Police Chief Carlton unless you were either a cop or a criminal? Who shot Jose?" "He's definitely not a cop," Jerry said when Rick didn't answer. "A cop wouldn't have left his mate to die." The barb hit home. Rick sat up, wincing, but glaring at Jerry so hard that his eyes bulged. "You weren't there." Rob smiled slowly. "But you were, clearly. Tell us what happened." Rick sighed, defeated as he realized his mistake. He lay back on the pillows again, his face grey. "I'm not naming any names." Neither Rob nor Jerry responded. Rick sighed. "Let's just say I heard some stuff, okay? That's all I'm saying." "Okay, that's good." Rob nodded encouragingly. They were lucky to get that much. "So, maybe I heard that this Jose guy was sent here to check out the mountain pass, okay? That he heard it was a good place for a certain exchange of goods." "Right," Jerry nodded. "Goods." Rick shifted in the bed. "Except maybe someone else wants it too. Someone trying to start something bigger, take over the whole trade. Because things in Melbourne have been messy." Rob's eyes narrowed. His arrest of a prominent gang leader last year had disrupted Melbourne's drug trade, which of course was a good thing. If only there weren't so many others ready to step straight into the gap. "Okay, that makes sense. So, the civil war in Melbourne has spilled all the way to Eastbrooke because of the mountain passes?" Rick shrugged. "This is all hearsay, okay? It's not quite that simple. This guy, the word is he's not even from here. Not even an Aussie. He's got ties to some big people." Jerry's eyebrows shot up. "The Mafia?" Rick rolled his eyes. "You've been watching too much TV. No, worse." Rob frowned. Who could possibly be worse than the Mafia? Then he had a sinking feeling. Rick had mentioned his father. "Neo-Nazi groups," he whispered. Rick nodded. "Yeah, and I don't just mean some city gang. That group your father disrupted, their roots went deep." Grief and long-buried fury squeezed Rob's heart. The real leaders of the group that killed his father had never been found. If this guy had ties to them, Rob shook his head. He couldn't afford to dredge up old grievances right now. "That's it," Rick said. "That's all I know. Before you tell me it's off record or try and start bribing me, I don't know the guy's name, okay? I just know that whoever he is, he's worrying a lot of people who aren't easily worried." He closed his eyes, signaling he was done. Jerry opened his mouth to say more, but Rob shook his head. They wouldn't get any more out of Rick today. He stood to leave, looking down at the man on the bed. "Rick." "The name ain't Rick," he mumbled, his voice slurred. The painkillers were kicking in. "Okay, whoever you are," Rob said. "Think about my offer. We can help you. Otherwise, what options do you have? We can't keep protection on your door without a good reason. You can't go back to Melbourne. You can't stay on the loose here. What are you going to do?" Take your chances on the mountains again? People die up there. I don't need your help. Leave me alone or I'll ring my buzzer. That matron doesn't look like she'll fall for your charms too easy. You'd be surprised, Jerry muttered under his breath as he walked out. Rob followed, then paused at the door and glanced back at Rick. On his arm, amidst all the gang tattoos, was an intricately inked cross. Impulsively, he asked, "Are you religious, Rick?" Rick opened one eye. "I was raised Catholic," he said suspiciously. "Why?" "No reason," Rob said as a strange wave of pity flowed through him. "But maybe it would be a good time to pray." Rick laughed bitterly. "God don't listen to the prayers of people like me." He had both eyes open again, and for a second he looked oddly vulnerable. Rob caught his gaze and said quietly, "I believe he does. Try it." Then he left and hurried after Jerry, once again feeling unsettled. It was turning out to be a strange couple of days. A short while later, back at the station, Rob looked up as Jerry stormed in, his face dark. "Johnson!" he harumphed as he flopped into his chair. "What's happened?" Rob asked, frowning. "He pulled the guy who replaced Eli off Rick's door, and he's not an official suspect or witness, so he can't afford round-the-clock protection." Rob groaned and rolled his eyes. "Did you tell him he gave us a lot of information? I've just sent it down to Melbourne." "Yeah. He said it was just hearsay. He wants it gone so he can retire quietly and leave us to deal with the future consequences." Rob let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his chair. Hopefully Melbourne will get up here to question him before he decides to discharge himself. Too late. That's what I'm mad about. The hospital just called. He's already gone. We're back to square one. "Not necessarily," Rob said, trying to remain upbeat. "Let's see what we can find out about this neo-Nazi guy." "Melbourne won't share information with us. This will be taken out of our hands now." "No," Rob said firmly. "It might come to that, but I'm not giving up yet. The whole town is terrified. No one will go near that creek. I'm not having criminals moving in on Eastbrooke." Jerry angled his head. "You're an odd guy. You're too talented for a small-town force. But you really love the place, don't you? Is that why you stayed? Is it because of your dad?" Rob blinked. "Have you been taking classes in psychoanalysis or something?" Jerry laughed, and the tension dissolved. But he was right. This was starting to feel personal. That meant it would be for his brother, too. "Jerry," he said quietly, leaning forward, "we're not telling Eli about this. He's off this case. Stick him on traffic or something." Jerry whistled. "He won't be happy about that. He's another one who's wasted on Eastbrooke." "Even so," Rob insisted. Jerry nodded, and Rob knew he understood. Of the four brothers, Eli still carried the most bitterness around their father's death. Any indication that this was even loosely related would send him off on a search for revenge. Rob wasn't about to risk getting his brother hurt. The rest of the afternoon went by in a blur. There was no sign of Rick, although they drove around to look for him anyway, and they put Joseph on alert. The Melbourne Special Forces were angry he'd slipped through their fingers, and, as predicted, refused to share any information regarding what Rick had told them, other than to say there was an ongoing investigation. Rob had a horrible feeling that if they didn't get this resolved quickly, it would blow up out of proportion, potentially endangering the citizens of Eastbrooke. Jerry was right. He loved the place, and like his father before him, he felt fiercely protective of it. As he drove home that evening, he passed by Emma's house and found himself slowing down, hoping for a glimpse of her. He sped up again, telling himself not to be so silly. She'd made it clear she wasn't interested, and besides that, she wasn't his type. Even so, she remained on his mind all evening, And when he lay down in bed and tried to clear his head for sleep, images of her, laughing with him over lunch on Sunday, were there again, jumbled with images of Jose's body in the creek, snippets of the minister's sermon in church, and the tattoo on Rick's arm. After a while he sat up, frustrated. Usually he was asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. Instead, he did something he hadn't done before sleep in a long time. Putting his hands together, he prayed. He prayed for Rick, who was wandering somewhere out there, in pain and in danger, and for Eastbrooke to be protected and safe from harm. He prayed for God to keep Eli away from bitterness, and for Max and Jania's baby. Then, finally, he prayed for Emma, although he didn't quite know what to pray for. Keep her safe, Lord. Let her be happy in life and find someone to cherish her, even if that can't be me. His own silent words surprised him, but they were from the heart. He lay back down on the pillow, feeling oddly more at peace although nothing was resolved. Chapter 7. Emma began to wish she'd accepted Max's offer to pick her up as she made her way up the track that led to the ranch. Or at least, she was fairly sure this was the shortcut Jania had described. The directions had sounded a lot clearer on the phone than the terrain appeared in real life, and she had a definite feeling that at some point she'd walked straight past the turning she should have taken. The track was starting to incline steeply, but she thought the ranch was at the bottom of the mountain, not up it. She'd been distracted, thinking about Rob, and hadn't paid enough attention to where she was going. It annoyed her that he'd been haunting her thoughts for the last 2 days, and the more she tried not to think about him, the more her mind insisted on conjuring him up. His invitation to have coffee had taken her by surprise, but after her knee-jerk refusal, she had mixed feelings. Perhaps she'd been too presumptuous in assuming his invitation was for a date, not just coffee. He may have simply intended to be friendly. After all, she was relatively new to town and was friendly with his mother and sister-in-law. But something made her wary of him. Plus, she wasn't looking for a relationship. Friendship, maybe, but even that could be dangerous with someone like him. She'd only had one serious boyfriend, another trainee teacher she'd met while doing her degree. He'd wanted to get married. She wasn't ready to commit, so he broke it off. The experience had left her a little jaded, and when she returned to Ethiopia, she'd been far too busy to think about relationships anyway. The path grew steeper and she began to puff. She peeled off her jacket and tossed it over her shoulder. She was just about to retrace her steps when she came across a turn. Perhaps this was it. She hadn't gone more than 5 minutes down the path when she hit a wall of bushes. Her first guess had been correct. She'd missed the turn way back down the track. With a sigh, she turned to head back the way she'd come when she heard voices nearby, a little further into the undergrowth. Male voices. And they sounded not quite angry, but definitely threatening. Holding her breath, she peered through the undergrowth, trying not to make a sound. The light was poor, but she made out 2 men. One of them had a gun. She froze. A heavy-set man with a bald head and tattoos was being forced to his knees by the other man holding the gun, which was pointed at the back of the tattooed man's head. Once on his knees, he seemed resigned to his fate, staring straight ahead. His lips were moving, and he looked up, to the sky. She got the impression he was praying. She wanted to say something, shout out, do something to help, but her limbs were frozen, and when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. The shot, when it came, was so loud in the quiet of the bush that she jumped, startled before she could stop herself, rustling the leaves around her. The man holding the gun looked up, and even through the leaves his gaze met hers as he looked straight into her eyes. "Hey!" he shouted and started towards her. She fled, her limbs no longer frozen, moving faster than she knew she could. She screamed as another shot rang out behind her. He was shooting at her. Her breaths came fast as she sprinted to get away. Back on the track, she fled in the direction she'd come, screaming at the top of her voice, hoping that being on the open road would deter her pursuer. Not that anyone would be out here on the mountain. Another shot rang out, and this time she was sure the bullet whizzed past her, just inches from her head. "Lord," she screamed silently, "please lead me to safety. I need to tell someone what I saw." She prayed for the man on his knees, even though she knew there was little chance of him still being alive. Footsteps pounded down the road behind her, gaining on her. Her side cramped with pain as she pushed harder. Her eyes burned with tears. Her flight was futile. Despite her prayers, she would be caught, shot dead. Then, there it was. The turn she'd missed. It was small, like Jania had told her. She veered off the track and took it, praying the man hadn't seen where she'd gone. The space opened up and lights shone in front of her. "Max!" she screamed at the top of her voice. "Call the police!" As she neared the building, she glanced over her shoulder. Relief filled her. She wasn't being followed. She keeled over as cramps tore through her body, holding onto her calves and trying to catch her breath. In front of her, a door opened. It was Max with a shotgun in hand. He raced to her side. "Emma!" "He had a gun," she babbled, her words tripping over themselves. The man was on his knees. He was praying and then he got shot. The gunman saw me and shot at me and—" She fell against Max, sobbing. He helped her to the house. Jania stood on the front porch, her arms out. "Come inside," she said soothingly, "and tell us what happened. Max, is anyone out there?" "Not that I saw. Where did this happen, Emma?" "Up the track a bit. Off to the side." Jania helped her inside and settled her into a chair by the fire. She was grateful for its warmth because she was suddenly freezing all over. Dimly aware that she was in shock, she felt oddly disassociated from herself, as though the real Emma was watching this shaking, crying woman from somewhere far away. "I'll call Rob," Max said. The blood drained from Emma's face. "He could get shot. I shouldn't have put you all in danger by coming here. The guy could have seen where I went." Her hand flew to her mouth as she thought about Jania and the baby. Jania took her hand, her voice low and calm. "Whatever happened out there," she said softly, "you've done the right thing by coming here. You're safe now. Max has a gun, and we're going to call the police and get this sorted, okay? You're safe," she repeated, but although Emma nodded, her teeth chattered. Jania squeezed her hand. "Let's pray," she said, bowing her head. Emma followed suit, although her thoughts felt too scattered to pray. "Heavenly Father," Jania began, "let your peace settle on Emma. You are our rock, our refuge, and our shield. Be with her now. Guard her as your most precious daughter. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen." "Amen," Emma echoed. And she felt, if not exactly at peace, then at least a little calmer. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you." Max had left the room to call Rob. He returned with a mug, which he handed to her. It smelled potent. She frowned. "It's brandy," he said. "I know you don't usually drink, and neither do we, but it's good for shock." She nodded slowly and sipped the small amount of brown liquid. It burned her throat, but felt pleasantly warm as it settled in her belly. Jania patted her hand. "I preferred the prayer," Emma quipped, starting to feel a little more like herself again. "But thank you, I feel warmer now." Hesitantly, she recounted what had happened. Jania's face paled, and Max pursed his lips angrily, shaking his head.
Whoever this guy is, the police will catch him. Neither Rob nor Eli will stop until this is over. I know my brothers."
"Would you recognize him if you saw him again?" Jania asked.
Emma nodded.
Maybe, but she shuddered at the thought of ever seeing him again. Suddenly, Eastbrooke didn't seem such a tranquil haven after all. A knock sounded on the door, the sudden noise making her nearly jump out of her skin. Max went to answer it.
"It'll be Rob,"
but he took his shotgun nevertheless. Chapter 8. Rage and an urge to protect surged through Rob as Emma recounted her story to him and Jerry. When she described the man, and then described seeing him pray, he closed his eyes briefly, remembering his last words to Rick, who, of course, the unfortunate man had to be. His rage turned into a steely determination to find those responsible, but the urge to protect only grew as Emma finished her tale and then seemed to deflate into herself, exhausted. She'd been through a huge ordeal, but this instinctive feeling to watch over her and keep her safe was entirely personal. Right now, though, he had a job to do. As Jerry took her statement, Rob contacted his officers and Mountain Rescue to search for the scene of the crime, and the body. Joseph answered the Mountain Rescue line and listened in silence as Rob recounted what had happened and gave him a rough location based on what Emma had told him. When Rob finished, his younger brother took a deep breath.
"This is all getting quite alarming, isn't it?"
"It's certainly more than we're used to dealing with," Rob agreed. "But we'll catch whoever's behind this. The city police have been reluctant to share their information, but I think at this point they'll have to. But I doubt we'll be on this case much longer. This is bigger than we can handle." Rob couldn't help feeling a twinge of hurt pride as he uttered those words. This was his jurisdiction, and the thought of officers from out of town taking over the investigation annoyed him, even though he knew this was bigger than anything a small-town force could cope with. Now that Emma was involved, it had also become personal. The thought of how close she'd come to getting shot filled him with a terror he wasn't yet ready to analyze. "Are Jania and Max okay?" Joseph asked. "Yes, just alarmed. Jania's being great with Emma. Max is frothing at the mouth to go and search the mountain himself, but thankfully he's a bit more sensible these days now he's about to become a father." "Right. I'll fire the helicopter up and keep you posted. God be with you." Joseph rang off and Rob returned to the lounge. Emma's face was white, her eyes huge against her pale skin, and with her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms hugging them, she looked unbearably fragile. He had the urge to sweep her into his arms and take her far away from here, somewhere that was safe. She looked up and smiled weakly. He hadn't seen her since she'd politely turned down his offer of coffee, but that didn't seem to matter now. "Do you want to stay here tonight?" Jania asked her. "It's probably a good idea to have some company. You've had a terrible ordeal." Emma winced. "Thank you so much, and I'd love to spend time with you and Max, but it's so near to what happened." Jania nodded with understanding and looked up at Rob. "Perhaps you could take her to your mother's place." "Good idea, I'll call her now." Emma straightened, twisting her hands together. "I don't want to be any bother. I'm fine, honestly. I probably just need a good sleep." Rob shook his head. "I'd rather you had some company tonight. Jania's right. You've gone through an ordeal, and Mum will insist. Trust me. If she finds out I took you home and left you alone instead of taking you there, she'll make my life a misery for at least a decade." Behind him, Max chuckled. Emma laughed weakly, but looked relieved. "I probably could use the company," she admitted. "That's what I thought. Come on." He and Jerry drove her to his mother's house, and when they arrived, Rob filled both her and Eli in on what had happened. Horrified, his mum immediately fussed over Emma as Rob had known she would. Then Jerry got a call. The body had been found. As Rob headed out the door with Jerry, Eli called him back. His younger brother's eyes blazed with anger. Rob suppressed a sigh. He knew what was coming. But did Eli really have to pick right now? "I've got to go," he said. Eli ignored him. "Why have you bumped me off this case?" he demanded angrily. "I know it came from you and not Johnson. We needed someone on traffic, especially with the road leading to Jacobs Creek closed." Eli glared at him. "I'm better than standing around waving road directions at people. Even I started on traffic, Eli," Rob pointed out. "I'm not a newbie, Rob. You're 24, and I've been a police officer since I was 20, as have you. You're pushing me out. This has something to do with Dad, doesn't it?" Rob sighed heavily. He couldn't lie to him, not about this. Not directly, no. You know I'd tell you if it did. But it's a possibility that whoever's behind all this had ties to the gang Dad was hunting. The look of sheer rage that came over Eli's face and the mumbled cursing under his breath convinced Rob he'd been right to keep him away. "You're hot-headed, Eli, and I understand, but I can't have you making this personal." Eli narrowed his eyes. "I'm going to get whoever killed Dad one day, I swear." Rob stared at him in sympathy. If only there was something he could do to soothe the hurt in his baby brother's soul. "Go and look after Mum and Emma," he said softly before leaving him and jogging after Jerry. The body was where Emma had described, face down, with a bullet wound to the back of the head. As expected, there was no sign of a weapon or the perpetrator. It was another execution. Even before the body was rolled over, Rob knew it was Rick. The man was bald and had a cross tattoo on his arm. A wave of sadness washed over him, but then he recalled Emma saying she'd seen the man pray. Rob hoped the gangster had found some sort of repentance and peace before his premature death. Eric's face was a mask, his eyes grey, hard as flint, his expression unreadable, unless, like Lewis, you'd seen that look before and knew what it meant. It didn't bode well. "So, let me get this straight," Eric said slowly, his accent subtly coming through. "You were seen, and you left the body? Again?" Lewis sucked in a breath. If he got out of this room alive, he'd be a lucky man. "We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by bush. There was no way I could have known some woman would come blundering in." Eric blinked, impossibly slowly, his eyes fixed on Lewis's like a snake's. As usual, when he was talking to Eric, Lewis had to do his best not to show any fear. He was certain Eric could smell it, like all predators. Lewis was no innocent. He'd been a criminal since the tender age of 15, when his father had told him it was about time he was inducted into the family business. His father had been gunned down by a rival gang 5 years later, and Lewis had taken over, and taken such retribution on the gang in question that it was spoken of throughout Australia's criminal network to this day, 20 years later. He knew no other life than drug dealing, arms, smuggling and thuggery. Few people intimidated him, apart from Eric. It wasn't only the rumours Lewis had heard about how his latest boss dealt with his enemies. After all, there were plenty of those going around about Lewis himself. It was more that Eric exuded a coldness that Lewis hadn't seen before. The man didn't have a flicker of humanity in him. Worse than that was the borderline insanity and the pleasure he displayed in controlling and hurting those around him, the only emotion he showed other than the icy rage that currently radiated from him. Lewis wondered what the real reason was for Eric leaving the white supremacists. If perhaps he'd been kicked out. After all, even they had their limits. Lewis doubted Eric had any. 2 things Lewis did know about his boss. He detested failure, but he hated insubordination even more. You should have made sure you were further from civilization. This whole operation's now in danger of being aborted.
and I've put a lot of time and money into it. 2 bodies? We're in danger of having the feds on top of us, and that would be unbelievably bad, Lewis, especially for you." Lewis nodded, his pulse throbbing in his jaw. "I understand. What can I do?" Eric stared at him until Lewis dropped his gaze. The minutes ticked by while he waited for Eric to speak. When he did, his tone was almost nonchalant, which unnerved Lewis even more. "Would she be able to recognize you?" Lewis looked up. "The girl?" He shrugged. "Maybe not. It was getting dark, and when I caught her eye, she ran. She didn't look back when I gave chase." "When you gave chase and somehow managed to lose her, you mean? Even though you were armed and she wasn't?" Lewis swallowed. "She was zigzagging, and then she ran towards a building. I saw the lights come on." He was practically stammering, and he hated himself for his weakness. Intense anger flashed in Eric's eyes. "You carried out an execution within walking distance of someone's home? Were you trying to get caught, Lewis?" Lewis closed his eyes. Why had he mentioned the building? "I didn't know it was there. It was back from the road, hidden. I thought the spot was deserted." "Because you clearly didn't scope out a wide enough area." Lewis nodded. He was a hair's breadth away from begging for his life, but that would only antagonize Eric even more. He could do nothing but wait and accept his fate. "You're right," he said, the words sinking in his throat. "I failed." "You know," Eric mused. "I really am incredibly disappointed. You came well recommended, Lewis. I expected better. Instead, you've been something of a disaster from start to finish." Lewis didn't reply. He was wondering how Eric would kill him, or have him killed. He would have prayed for it to be quick, but he'd given up praying long ago. "Would you recognize her?" Eric asked abruptly. Lewis blinked. "Who? The girl?" Eric rolled his eyes. "Obviously the girl." I think so. Maybe. Yes," Lewis added, as anger seethed in Eric's eyes again. Eric pinned him with his steely gaze. "Find her and finish her." Lewis's eyes widened. "What?" Eric snapped. He wasn't a fan of being questioned. "Another murder? Won't it arouse even more suspicion? The drop-off happens in 4 days." "Let me worry about that," Eric said. "You won't be there, Lewis. Consider yourself demoted. Permanently if you mess this one up." Lewis knew exactly what that meant. "Make it look like a break-in. Give them something else to worry about for a few days. Understand? I want it done tomorrow." Lewis gulped. Tomorrow? He had no idea who the young woman was. He wasn't about to argue, so he nodded. As he turned to leave, Eric called him back. He smiled, but there was no mirth in it. "Yes, boss?" Lewis asked as coolly as he could manage. "If you mess this up, you're a dead man." As Lewis left the room, he had the sinking feeling that whether he messed up or not, his days were numbered. Chapter 9. The next morning, Rob stopped by his mum's house en route to the station. The team from Melbourne was heading to Eastbrooke, and while he wasn't looking forward to them taking over, after a long night filled with nightmares of Emma being shot in his arms, his pride was stinging less. The most important thing was that these killings stopped, and that she was safe. If that meant handing the case over to the city cops, well, so be it. Arriving at his mum's place, he greeted her with a kiss, feeling a twinge of disappointment when she told him that Emma had already left, although he tried not to show it. "Oh, how was she this morning?"
"Quiet. She left a little while ago to get changed for school. She wouldn't hear of having the day off. Said there wouldn't be enough time for them to get a replacement teacher. Very conscientious woman."
"Yes," Rob murmured, reaching for an apple from the fruit bowl and lifting his gaze when he felt hers on his. "What?"
"You like her," she said quietly.
He rolled his eyes and went to protest, but his mother raised a hand, a serious look on her face.
"I'm not matchmaking, Rob. I just have eyes. I saw the way you were with her last night, and Sunday at lunch."
"I was nothing but polite." His mother nodded.
"That's what I mean. You're not your usual charming, smiley self around her. You're almost awkward. I've never seen you like that around a girl."
He sighed heavily. There was no point lying to his own mother. She knew him better than he knew himself. Emma had gotten under his skin, and was curling herself around his heart, and the more he tried to deny it, the more he felt it. "It doesn't matter anyway," he shrugged. "She turned me down."
"You asked her on a date?"
His mother's eyes widened. "Not really, just coffee. It was completely spontaneous. We were talking in the car. She's really easy to talk to, and you know I don't often confide in anyone. I was just being friendly."
"And what did she say?"
"That she was busy," he said glumly.
"Oh."
She looked at him with puppy dog eyes. She may as well have said she was washing her hair. His shoulders drooped. His mother slipped her arm around his shoulders.
"Perhaps it was a little premature. I don't think she's a casual date kind of girl. At least that's the impression I get."
"But what if I'm not casual about her?" he blurted. Then he felt his cheeks warm. "I'm just tired," he said, blowing out a breath and rubbing his eyes.
"You don't have to be ashamed of having feelings, Rob," his mother said softly. "It's about time, don't you think?"
He dropped his gaze to his hands, feeling uncomfortable, like a little boy under his mother's scrutiny. "I don't know what you mean."
"I think you do," she said, sitting next to him at the table. "I've watched you over the years. You get on with everyone, and yet you get close to no one, except your brothers and me. You hide it well, but in some ways you're as aloof as Max."
"I'm not." He was nothing like Max. He'd practically lived alone on a mountain before marrying Jania.
"You're scared of love,"
his mother said, matter-of-factly.
"And I know why. It's because of your father."
Her words tightened a cord around his heart. He pushed his apple away, no longer hungry. "It's a bit early for psychotherapy, Mum," he joked weakly, but she wasn't letting it go.
"You can't let what happened to your father stop you from living your life, Rob. Not now you've found someone you could potentially share it with."
"I barely know her," he protested. "And you've been on your own since Dad died," he pointed out. His mother was still an attractive woman, yet she'd never considered remarrying.
"That's not because I'm scared."
Her face softened and her eyes took on a faraway look.
"It's because I'm content with having your father for as long as I did. He was my soulmate. I wouldn't want to marry anyone else, and I'm not lonely or bitter."
He searched her face. Her eyes were clear. She spoke the truth. Her words were from the heart. "I remember how much the two of you loved each other." Grief tugged at his heart as he recalled his childhood. They'd been such a happy family, and he put that down to the special relationship his parents shared. "And us," he continued, his voice thick. "We had the perfect family. I don't suppose I appreciated that."
"You were just a child," she said gently.
"When Dad died, he left such a hole in our lives." He blinked back tears as that raw place inside him surfaced. "Don't you ever think, if it wasn't for the fact that you had us kids, it would have been better to not go through that?" A small breath escaped his mother's mouth as she lifted a hand and gently brushed the back of it against his cheek.
"Oh, my darling," she said softly. "Do you really not know the answer to that? I wouldn't change a second that I had with your father. Not a single moment. Yes, it hurt to lose him, and it hurt even more to see you boys having to deal with the loss. But I still thank God every day that he was part of our lives. And besides," she added with a smile, "I'll see him again, in eternity."
You really believe that? He'd grown up with the notion of an afterlife, but it had never been more than an abstract concept while this certainty in his mother's voice was tangible.
"With all my heart,"
she confirmed, smiling. Moments ticked by before she stood and put the kettle on. "None of it matters anyway," he said lightly. "Like I said, Emma turned me down. She's not interested. I really doubt I'm her type."
"Nonsense," his mother said briskly, retrieving 2 mugs from the shelf. "I see the way she glances at you when she thinks no one's looking."
"Really? Emma might actually like him?" A grin spread across his face, and for a moment he felt like a schoolboy. But then he shook his head. "You're just imagining it, Mum."
"No, I'm right. I'm telling you," she insisted.
"Then why would she say no to coffee?" He didn't understand. His mother sighed.
"For someone so handsome and clever, you really don't know much about women, do you?"
She raised an amused brow.
"Emma isn't a frivolous girl, Rob, whereas you are a charmer."
"It's just the way I am," he shrugged, grinning. "But I'm never disrespectful. I'd never treat a woman badly."
"I know that, and I'm not saying for one moment that Emma would think anything else.
But
you go for coffees all the time. You date."
"The last 2 you set me up with," he pointed out.
"All I'm saying," she continued, ignoring his comment, "is that Emma is the sort of girl you need to make an effort for. You have to woo her, not expect her to just fall at your feet. You've been too used to that. Everyone likes you, Rob. No one could refuse you anything as a child with that smile of yours, least of all me and your father."
She smiled indulgently as she handed him a mug of coffee. He mulled over her words as he sipped the steaming drink. Maybe she was right. Maybe he did need to make more of an effort, make Emma feel special. There was only one problem with that. They were in the middle of a murder investigation. He sighed. "At the moment she's a witness to a murder in what is still currently my case. She's under my protection. I can't think of her in any other way."
"Maybe not right now, but just remember what I said. I would rather have had the time with your father and lost him than never have had him at all. Trust God, Rob. Let him lead you in this."
He nodded. He wanted to tell her about his feelings at church on Sunday and how he'd been praying ever since. But there wasn't time now. He swigged back his coffee, got up and kissed her on the cheek. "I'd better go."
"Stay safe, son. I'll be praying for you."
Chapter 10. Emma walked off to the staff room to grab her cardigan. She was on her lunch break, and while she usually brought sandwiches, that morning she'd turned down Jean's offer to make her something for lunch. After a night of tossing and turning, reliving that horrid event, she hadn't felt hungry, nor anticipated ever feeling so again. Now, though, her stomach rumbled. She needed something to eat after all. There was a cafe at the end of the road, and apart from grabbing something, getting away for half an hour or so might do her good. Clear her head. Settle her nerves. She'd thought that going to work as usual was the best thing to do, but all morning she'd been jittery, startling at every noise. And she knew her class had noticed something was wrong. The image of the man on his knees, followed by the sudden loud crack of the gunshot. So loud it seemed to pierce the very air, replayed over and over in her mind. Growing up in Ethiopia, a place beset by poverty and unrest, she was hardly sheltered when it came to the harsh realities of life, but she'd never witnessed a murder and had never been pursued by someone shooting at her. No matter how much she tried to soothe her mind by praying continually, her nerves were on edge and her thoughts scattered. Why hadn't she listened to Jean and given herself a few days off? She was too conscientious. She knew that. But she was doing the children a disservice if she couldn't read a story without images of the armed man flashing through her mind. She'd somehow finish the day and take tomorrow off. Slipping on her cardigan, she buttoned it, feeling cold in spite of the warmth of the day. She left the school by the side gate that turned onto High Street and walked towards the little cafe that she often thought looked inviting but had never yet visited. The woman behind the counter, who had long dark hair and a timid smile, took her order and then waved her to a small corner table where Emma sat and watched people passing by, going about their day, feeling oddly detached from normality. How could Rob stand being a police officer, dealing with this kind of thing constantly? Perhaps that was the reason for the barrier behind his casual friendliness. A wariness that prevented him from getting close to people. Smiles on the surface, but hardened underneath. His way of coping. Thinking about Rob warmed her, and a smile played on her lips despite herself. She believed his concern for her the night before had been genuine. A small crack in his armour. Maybe she should have accepted his offer of coffee after all. She ate her sandwich and sipped her juice in silence. After finishing, she still felt shaken, but less jittery and detached, and more able to get on with the afternoon. She carried her plate to the counter, thanked the dark-haired woman, and left the cafe to walk back to the school, feeling more prepared for her afternoon class. As she walked, however, her spine tingled. Was someone watching her? Her heart thudded as she stopped and turned. Her head jerking around sharply, she scanned the area. No one suspicious. A few cars parked further down the road. An old man walking by on the opposite side of the street with his equally old dog. A young mother pushing a baby in a pram a few meters behind her. She drew a slow breath, turned around and picked up her pace. Although she'd seen no one suspicious, the sense of being watched didn't leave her. Lewis waited until the woman turned down a side street, then started the car and drove down the road at a deliberately casual pace. When she'd turned and looked back, her eyes had seemed to look right through him just as they had the night before, seconds after he shot Rick. Luckily, she hadn't noticed him hunched behind the steering wheel. As he passed where she'd turned, he craned his head. It was an alleyway that led directly to the primary school. She must work there. All he had to do now was wait for the end of the work day and discreetly follow her home. Then, when it was dark, he'd strike, ensuring it looked like a robbery gone wrong. Without a witness, there was no danger of being caught. And no matter how hard the local authorities searched the surrounding mountains, they were unlikely to find his and Eric's bunker, which was hidden so well that even aerial patrols wouldn't find it. Eric's plan to use the most hidden and dangerous of the mountain passes for his new business interests was ingenious, and Lewis knew that if it wasn't for his own recent mistakes, the police would have no idea they were even in the area. He was lucky that Eric had let him live, but he suspected it wouldn't be for long. In fact, he had an extraordinarily strong suspicion that once he cleaned up this mess with the woman, he'd be a dead man himself. He'd do the same if he was in Eric's situation. He could run, but where to? Eric would hunt him, regardless of where he went. He'd entertained the idea of taking Eric out before Eric took him, but quickly discarded it. Eric was too powerful, and the rest of his henchmen were always nearby, watching. The best Lewis could hope for was that he got things right from now on and that Eric would change his mind. That meant getting rid of the girl. He sped up and headed out of town before pulling over on a deserted road. Taking his phone from his pocket, he took a deep breath as he scrolled through to Eric's name and then called him. Eric picked up halfway through the first ring. "Have you found her?" His voice was gruff and demanding. "Yes, she works at the school. I'll follow her home and strike when it's dark." "Take Elliot with you," Eric said in a tone that sounded almost bored. "And don't mess this one up, Lewis, for your own sake." The line went dead. Lewis clenched his fist. He couldn't mess this up. He had to do away with the girl. If he wanted to live, he had no option. Emma walked home that afternoon with the same unnerved feeling that someone was watching her. She refused to give in to it and look behind her, but she walked home at double her usual pace. Once she got inside the house, she locked the door behind her, then checked the back door. She briefly considered calling Rob, but decided against it. She had nothing to tell him other than she thought she'd been followed with absolutely no evidence to support it. I need to get a grip. It's just my imagination running wild. After a shower and a light meal, she felt a little better. Messages from Jania and Jean flashed on her phone. She messaged back rather than calling. Although glad of their support, she couldn't face talking about the previous evening. There was also a brief message from Rob. Hope you're okay. Call if you need anything. She stared at it for a moment, then simply replied, thanks. She set her phone down and took her files out, hoping that doing next week's lesson plans would take her mind off everything. It was getting dark when she finally put her paperwork down and went into the kitchen to make a hot chocolate before having an early night. While stirring her drink, the back porch light snapped on. Because it was sensory activated, she jumped and let out a little scream. With her heart thumping, she peered through the window into her small back garden. Nothing was there. It's probably just an animal crossing through. A possum, perhaps? The light went out after a few seconds, and she returned to her hot chocolate. Moments later, her front door was shot open, and she screamed. Chapter 11. Rob blinked his tiredness away as he started to drive home. He'd worked a 12-hour shift, and it was growing dark. He longed for a hot shower and bed. It had been a frustrating day. Scouring the mountains, even with Joseph's help, had revealed nothing. Searching for the gunman was like looking for a needle in a haystack, it seemed. He'd also spent most of the morning on the phone to the officer heading to Eastbrooke with a small team to take over the case. While he knew it was for the best, it still rankled his pride. This was his case and his town. In the end, he'd gone into the station's restroom and prayed for humility, which had left him feeling marginally better. Deep down, he knew the situation was beyond a small-town force, and the important thing was wrapping the case up, capturing the person behind it all, and ensuring the people of Eastbrooke were safe. Making sure Emma was safe. He'd thought about her all day, despite trying not to. He kept seeing her sitting before Max's fire, her face pale and her hands shaking, and feeling the rage again at the man who'd shot at her. It was probably best he wouldn't be in charge much longer. It was becoming way too personal. He hadn't expected the call he'd received that morning, however, for it hadn't been an officer from the Melbourne force. Instead, the case was being turned over to the feds. Whoever they thought might be in charge of this operation, it was someone big. Driving home, he passed the end of Emma's street. He should go and check on her. Her response to his earlier message was brief and told him nothing. He wanted to know that she was truly okay. But turning up to her house late at night, unannounced, could be considered unprofessional. However, as he drove on, a nagging feeling from somewhere deep inside told him he needed to check on her. He turned back and circled the block near her house, feeling that something was terribly wrong. A sense of urgency tugged at him. The inner voice, louder now. She's in danger. Years of being on the police force had taught him to trust his instincts. He hit the gas and sped towards her house. Please, Lord, he prayed spontaneously. Let her be okay. As though in reply, the sense of urgency came again, and he drove faster. He should have sent an officer to check on her earlier. Insisted she stay at his mother's where she wouldn't be alone. She was a witness to a murder, and that placed her in danger. Although she thought the killer hadn't seen her clearly enough to identify her, she could easily be wrong. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced she was in acute danger. As he turned onto her street, his worst fears were realized. The streetlights revealed a black sedan with frosted windows parked outside her house. 2 men with balaclavas on and weapons drawn jumped out and ran up her front path. They didn't bother to knock. One of them shot the front door open before they ran in. Rob's heart pounded as his adrenaline spiked. His first instinct was to leap out of the car and tackle the men himself, but his years of training took over. It would be a foolish move. Although he was armed, he was outnumbered against 2 obviously dangerous criminals, and if shots were fired inside, Emma could be hurt, or worse. His stomach lurched as he screeched to a halt behind the sedan and radioed Jerry. 2 masked, armed men entering Emma Humphrey's house. Forced entry. Send immediate backup. He paused, then barked. I'm going in. He wouldn't wait for backup. She'd be dead before they arrived. He pulled his police issue gun out of the dashboard compartment and jumped out of the car, heart in mouth. He prayed he wasn't too late. When a woman's scream came from inside the house, he could barely draw breath. He raced through the front door, his gun drawn and held close, ready to fire if necessary. The sound of Emma's voice, pleading, almost crying, came from the back of the house. He hurried down the hallway. A man stood in the kitchen doorway, blocking his view. Shoot her, he said in a calm voice. Rob raised his gun, took careful aim, and shot the man in the back of the thigh. The man cursed and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. Rob leapt forward and snatched the weapon he'd dropped. He aimed his own gun at the other man standing in the kitchen with his weapon pointed at Emma. She was backed up against the kitchen counter, tears streaming down her face, lips quivering. Her gaze flicked to Rob's, pleading with him to save her. Put the gun down, he ordered. His voice was emotionless, although his heart pounded. The thug sneered and jabbed his gun closer to Emma. She cringed, let out a small gasp. Where was Jerry? Rob fought to keep calm and not let his anger or fear show. Emotion would only escalate the situation. The man cursed in a language Rob didn't recognize. Put the gun down, he repeated. No one else needs to get hurt. There was a horrible, long moment that could have only lasted a few seconds, yet seemed to go on forever, where the man continued to point his gun at Emma, and Rob at him. They were in a stalemate that couldn't possibly end without someone being hurt badly or killed. Lord, Rob prayed silently, his heart pounding, please help us. Police sirens suddenly wailed outside, breaking the silence. Jerry. Relief filled him. The thug jerked. Rob took a step forward and cocked his gun. Drop it, he ordered again. The thug turned and fled out the back door as Jerry and Eli flew into the house through the front. Everything happened at once. Eli sprinted out the back door, chasing the still armed man. Jerry cuffed the injured man on the floor, read him his rights, and rang for an ambulance. Rob moved towards Emma, who collapsed in his arms, sobbing. He put his arms around her, the only thing holding her up as she trembled with shock. Shh, he murmured into her hair, his voice low and soothing. You're safe now. From now on, he'd do everything in his power to protect her, even if it meant not letting her out of his sight. Chapter 12. An hour later, despite his resolve not to leave her, Rob left Emma with his mother and Max to go to the hospital with Jerry to question the man who'd been shot. He knew they'd look after her, but it was difficult tearing himself away. He was furious with himself. She should have been in protective custody, or at the very least, not been left alone. She'd witnessed a murder, and these guys weren't amateurs, despite the mess they'd made over the past few days. He said as much to Jerry as they drove to the hospital. This is the second time in 2 weeks we've questioned an injured suspect. They're supposed to be organized criminals. Jerry nodded. They're panicking, and probably have been since the first body was found. Emma said the guy I shot was the same man she saw shoot Rick. I've taken her statement, but she's in shock. It might not stand up in court, but I believe her. The guy's trying to cover his tracks, or more likely, has been ordered to. Hence the panic and sloppiness, which means we might be able to get some information out of him. Jerry glanced sideways as he drove. Is that why we're in a rush to question him tonight, instead of leaving it until the feds arrive tomorrow? Rob shrugged. The more information we can give them, the happier they'll be. Jerry narrowed his eyes. What? Rob demanded. Ordinarily, I'd say this was just about your pride, wanting to show the feds you can do your job without their interference. But right now, I'm wondering if it's more about a certain young lady. Rob glared at him. What's that supposed to mean? Come on, Jerry smirked. It doesn't require a genius to see how taken you are with her. Rob groaned and slumped in his seat. Not you as well. You sound like my mother. Your mother's a very perceptive woman, Jerry said. Rob ignored the comment while Jerry snickered beside him as they headed to the hospital. The man, who'd given his name only as Lewis, was handcuffed to the bed and looked mutinous. His eyes were like daggers as Rob walked into the room. You're the one who shot me, he growled. That's right, Rob said, his voice like flint. He didn't have time for the games he'd played with Rick. This guy wasn't just a potential witness. He was in custody, a murder suspect. Rob had no doubt he'd gone to Emma's house with the sole intention of killing her, and his blood boiled in his veins. He wasn't a violent man, and violence went against all the morals that had been instilled in him during his Christian upbringing. But he had to jam his fisted hands in his pockets as he looked at Lewis. Why were you at Miss Humphrey's house? The man glared at him and didn't answer. There was a steely toughness to him that made Rob groan. He'd be harder to crack than Rick. Perhaps Jerry had been right about leaving this to the organized crime experts. He wanted, more than anything, to get back to Emma to ensure she was okay. What if someone else was sent to finish her off? His phone rang. It was Johnson. Giving Jerry a nod, Rob stepped into the hallway to answer it. Chief? Are you at the hospital? Yes, Rob replied. I'm about to question the man we apprehended at Emma Humphrey's place. I wouldn't bother, Johnson sighed. The feds are on their way. Tonight? I thought they were coming in the morning. As soon as they heard the name Lewis, they got excited. Leave the questioning to them, but stay until they arrive. I don't want another suspect going missing and getting killed. Relieve the junior officer, and you and Jerry guard the suspect. Don't let him out of your sight. Rob swallowed his annoyance at being ordered around. Johnson was the boss, after all, but Rob was used to being left in charge. It seemed he really did need to work on his pride. Yes, Chief, he said as agreeably as possible. In a low voice, Rob quickly filled him in. Great, Jerry grumbled. We're on watch duty again. It was 3 hours before the 2 plain-clothed federal police officers arrived. One was tall and blonde, perhaps in his 40s, the other heavy-set and dark, reminding Rob more of a Hollywood gangster than a serious crimes detective. Detective Myers, the blonde man introduced himself. And this is Detective Weaver. Are you Officer Robert Carlton? Rob nodded and extended his hand, which Myers shook. Let's grab a coffee, Myers suggested. Weaver can wait with your partner. Detective Weaver looked none too pleased. But Rob appreciated Myers' attempt to treat him as a professional equal. He led the way to the cafeteria, which was all but empty at this time of night. But they sat by the window with their coffees. Rob raised a brow at Myers. So, I'm guessing this isn't simply about getting to know each other. Myers grinned, and Rob decided he liked him. He lowered his voice, his expression serious. The suspect you have in custody is Lewis Regan. He's been evading us for years. Drug dealing, arms smuggling, and 5 suspected murders that we know he either committed or ordered. But we've never been able to pin on him. I wanted to say thank you for bringing him in. Rob shrugged offhandedly. As much as he wanted to bask in the praise, he'd simply been in the right place at the right time, for which he thanked God, recalling the whisper that had urged him to check on Emma. To be honest, he got sloppy, breaking into Miss Humphrey's house like that, and I got lucky. I happened to be driving past. Myers nodded. See, this is what's worrying us, and why we've been called in. Melbourne tipped us off. They think Lewis is working with someone we've had our eye on for even longer. And not just us. Interpol. Rob's eyebrows hiked. This is where the neo-Nazis come in. Myers nodded grimly. You've heard of the White League? The muscles in Rob's jaw tensed. The group my father was tracking. They were a splinter cell, if I'm correct. Myers' gaze held steady, as if studying him. Yes, the guy we believe Lewis is working for was a major player with the group, although he left a long time ago. Not long before your father's death, I believe. Disappointment flowed through Rob. For a moment, he thought they might be tracking the man responsible for killing his father. Why did he leave? He preferred crime to ideology, Myers said wryly. His name, if we've got the right guy, is Eric Horsburden, and he's a nasty piece of work, from South Africa originally. He makes Lewis look like a pussycat. Rob whistled through his teeth. So, Lewis is your way of getting to Eric. No wonder Myers wanted to thank him for bringing him in. Hopefully. Someone like Lewis won't turn informant easily, but we think he'll be in Eric's bad books after this week. He'll be fearing for his life. If we offer him witness protection, he might just take it. What if he doesn't? Myers shrugged. Then we threaten him with a long prison sentence, but we'll need Miss Humphreys to identify him. Rob bristled at the thought of causing Emma further distress, but she was the only one who could confirm it was Lewis who killed Rick. Myers' next words sent an icy chill through his body, confirming Rob's earlier fears. She needs to be in protective custody, or at least be guarded. She's your only witness. If Eric sent Lewis to dispose of her, he has even more reason to want her gone now. Rob swallowed hard and fought to keep his voice even. I've already thought of that. I'll guard her. He was suddenly glad he'd been demoted on this case, as now he could take on the role of Emma's protector until this was over. He wouldn't let anything happen to her, not on his watch. They returned to the ward, and Rob left Myers and Weaver to question Lewis, who went grey as they walked into his room. Do you think he'll talk? Jerry asked as he and Rob strolled to the car. Probably not, Rob sighed. Not straight away, anyway. Emma will need to identify him, and she needs to be in protective custody. In a safe house? Jerry asked. With me. Jerry blinked and looked at him curiously. I'll keep her safe, Rob said, his voice firm. I know, his partner said quietly. I was thinking more about you. I've known you a long time, my friend. You're falling hard. Rob let out a slow breath. Jerry spoke the truth. He could no longer deny his feelings for Emma. She was capturing his heart, and there was nothing he could do about it. Back at his mother's house, Rob joined Emma in the lounge room. She was curled up on an old brown sofa with a crocheted blanket over her. She lifted her head as he walked in. Her eyes were guarded. She seemed tense, as well she might, considering what she'd been through. The homicide case has been taken over by the federal police, he said, perching on the edge of the matching armchair. He leaned forward, held her gaze. I'm in danger, aren't I? She asked, her voice faltering. They came to kill me. He hated the fear in her eyes. It tore at him, and all he wanted to do was wrap her in his arms and keep her safe. Yes, and you might still be in danger. It's not safe for you to be alone. She straightened, pulling the blanket around her. So, what do I do? Her voice was steadier, and he felt a pang of pride at her show of resilience.
You'll stay with me until it's over." Her eyes widened.
"With you?"
He groaned inwardly. What a fool! He should have been more sensitive. She was a Christian, and having been raised with Christian principles himself, he understood her reluctance to be alone with him. "Emma," he said quietly, holding her gaze, "I'm not sure there's any other way. We can't allow you to stay on your own. I understand why you might not want to stay with me on your own, but I can assure you that I'm not in any way trying to take advantage of you. This is purely about keeping you safe. It's part of my job. If it wasn't so dangerous, we'd stay here with my mother, but I can't put her in danger too. I can get a female constable to stay with us if that makes you feel better." Her expression softened. "I wouldn't want to put your mother in danger. It's an odd situation, and I do trust you, Rob. But I think I'd like a female constable to stay as well." He bit his lip to stop a grin splitting his face. Despite everything, he heard the truth in her words. Her trust gave him a burst of joy amidst the horror of the day. "I'm glad," he smiled. Clearing his throat, he stood and said more formally, "I'll drive you back to your house first so you can pick up some things. Pack enough for a few days." "Do you think it'll be that long?" "At the moment, I know as much as you do." While she went to the bathroom, he quickly made a call to Jerry, asking him to arrange a female constable to meet him at his house. And then he went into the kitchen and told his mother and Max the plan. As expected, his mother suggested she come with him to look after Emma. He shook his head firmly. "No, Mum, it's dangerous." "Absolutely not." Max nodded in agreement as he fetched his coat. "I'd better go. Jania's at a friend's place and I need to pick her up. Stay safe, brother." He slapped Rob on the back, which was about as affectionate as Max ever got with anyone except their mother and Jania. Emma came into the kitchen, her cardigan buttoned up and her handbag over her shoulder. Her eyes were puffy, but she held her chin out defiantly. "Okay, bodyguard, let's go." Chapter 13. Emma drew a steadying breath as she approached the damaged front door of her house. It was past midnight, and the house was shrouded in darkness. A shudder raced up her spine as she recalled the moment the door had been shot open and the men ran inside. It felt like the house had been violated, and she wondered if she could ever live here again. Rob turned his flashlight on so she could see where she was going. A temporary lock had been placed on the door. He took the key from her and opened it, switching on the lights. The kitchen was cordoned off with crime scene tape, and there was blood on the hall carpet. She averted her eyes, feeling nauseous at the whole scene, trying to block the flood of memories. It had only been hours earlier, yet time seemed to have warped. It felt as though it had simultaneously occurred weeks ago and just minutes before. "I'll wait down here while you get your things," Rob said politely. She went up the stairs, her legs feeling like lead. In her bedroom, she found her hold-all at the back of her wardrobe and quickly threw in some jeans, t-shirts, underwear, and pajamas. Then went into the bathroom to fetch some toiletries. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror above the sink and startled at how pale she looked. She splashed some water on her face, and after brushing her hair, felt marginally better. As she walked back down the stairs, her gaze landed on Rob, and her breath hitched. He looked so handsome in his uniform, standing sentinel-like, protecting her. She was glad of his protection, although the idea of staying with him was strange. She felt safe in his presence, and she appreciated that he understood her discomfort. Without knowing why, she did trust him, but it wasn't just because he was a police officer and his job was to look after the witness. "Ready?" Concern filled his eyes as he searched her face. It must have been difficult coming here. His voice was soft, caring. She nodded, averting her gaze from the kitchen as she headed for the front door.
It feels like the place has been violated, she said quietly. I'll make sure it gets cleaned up before you return, he said. It won't take away what happened, but at least it'll be back to normal. Thank you, she said softly, stepping out onto the path. It was well past midnight, and she suddenly felt exhausted. The air was cool on her face, and she wrapped her cardigan tighter. As they drove to his house in silence, she struggled to keep her eyes open. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. The front lawn was neat and the front door looked freshly painted. Inside it was tidy and minimalist, with the only personal touch being a large photograph of him and his brothers when they were children, with a young, pretty Jean and a handsome man Emma guessed was his father. "Is that your dad?" she asked. "Yes," he replied with a quick smile. "You can tell, can't you?" "You all look like him, that's for sure." He showed her upstairs to a small guest bedroom. There was nothing in it other than a bed and a small dresser. "I'm sorry, it's not much," he apologized, looking embarrassed. "I'm not used to having people stay over, unless it's one of my brothers." "It's fine," she reassured him. Right now, she could probably sleep on a wooden bench. He hesitated in the doorway, his gaze darting. "Can I get you a hot drink or anything?" "I just need to sleep, but thank you for everything." "You're welcome. The female constable will be here soon. Good night, Emma." "Good night, Rob," she said, but he'd already left. She shut the door quietly and changed into her pajamas. After taking the pocket Bible from her handbag, she climbed into bed. Although her eyes were heavy and her body desperate for sleep, she needed the comfort of the Word after such a harrowing night. Once again, she turned to Psalm 61, and this time the words seemed more poignant than ever. "Hear my cry, O God. Listen to my prayer. From the ends of the earth I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Lead me to the rock which is higher than I. For you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever, and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you, God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name." She placed the Bible down by the side of the bed and closed her eyes, reflecting on the words she had just read, allowing them to sink in and penetrate her soul. "You are my refuge, Lord," she whispered, "my rock and my strong tower. I thank you that I'm safe and well. Thank you for Rob and Jerry, that they came to my aid when I needed them, and for Jean and Max and Eli. Thank you for sending friends and protectors. Please keep the people of Eastbrooke safe from the dark forces gathering around. Place a hedge around the town, Lord. Help the police apprehend the villains before anyone else gets hurt. Keep us all in the shadow of your wings, for you are the Almighty God, our Lord and Saviour." Her thoughts drifted to the moment the two men burst into her house, and she shuddered as she recalled the fear she felt when the gun was pointed at her. Yet, for all of their evil acts, those men were children of God. They just didn't know him. "Help me, Lord," she prayed fervently, "to forgive those who tried to hurt me, for vengeance is yours and yours alone, and you are a just and merciful God. I pray that they may see the error of their ways and find their way to you. In humility and repentance, in Jesus' name, I pray. Amen." Finally, she turned off the lamp on the dresser and allowed much-needed oblivion to calm her. Emma pushed her way through the undergrowth. Branches scratched her face. The moon shone overhead. It felt like she'd been lost for hours. Surely that was Max and Jania's house up ahead, yet she seemed to be going around in circles. Panic mounted inside her. She could barely breathe. She kept trying to pray, but she was unable to speak. "Hello, Emma," a voice sounded behind her. It must be Rob. come to show her the way. She spun around, relieved. A man stood there, pointing a gun at her, his eyes glinting with evil. She turned and fled, but it felt like she was moving through treacle. He was gaining on her. She tried to scream, but all that came out was a pitiful whimper. "Emma," he called behind her. "Emma! Emma! Emma! Wake up!" She sat bolt upright, her mouth open, ready to scream, her heart thundering in her chest. It was Rob, and she was in his house. She was safe. Her panting slowed, and she breathed out a shaky sigh of relief, then buried her head in her hands. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I was dreaming. I was lost near the ranch, and that man was there, pointing a gun at me." Rob sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "It's okay," he said soothingly. "You're safe. It was just a dream." "I'm sorry," she said again, embarrassed that once again he'd witnessed her at her most vulnerable. "There's no need to apologize. It's only natural that you'd have nightmares after everything you've been through. You've been incredibly brave." "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified." "It's going to be okay." He gave a comforting smile. "I won't let anything happen to you." She nodded, feeling a little better as the memories of her dream drifted away. His gaze settled on the Bible next to her bed. "Do you read it every night?" She nodded again. "Yes, and then I pray. Don't you?" He winced. "Not as much as I should, although I've been praying more this week." "Because of everything that's happened?" "Kind of, but not really." His gaze dropped to his hands, and he looked so vulnerable that a surge of protectiveness for him flowed through her. "It was the sermon last week. It really got to me." He lifted his gaze and met hers. "You know when the minister was talking about being saved by grace, as opposed to works?" She smiled. "It's the essence of the gospel, and why Christianity really is such good news." "Well, the thing is, it didn't feel like good news. It made me uncomfortable. I've been exactly the person the minister spoke about, taking pride in how righteous and good I am, knowing that because of what I do, everyone sees me as a good guy." "You are a good guy." "Maybe," he said, "but it's a source of pride for me, a big part of my identity, to the point that I've made it the center point of who I am, instead of God. And it makes me judgmental of others, like, if I'm the good guy, then others must be the bad guys. So I'm okay with God. I'm in, they're out. But this week, after hearing that sermon, that whole way of thinking has been upended." Emma studied him. "It wasn't easy bearing your soul, admitting you're wrong." She got the feeling he'd never talked to anyone like this before. He seemed genuinely open, vulnerable. "That's not a bad thing," she finally said softly, "because it's so radical. The gospel can and does make people uncomfortable. No one can earn their way to heaven. That's not a cop-out. It means we have to admit we're sinners and accept the gift of Jesus' saving grace. That's the only way we can be saved. We must always try to live the way He wants us to, but we should never be proud of our works for their own sake." "Which is what I've always done," he said contritely. "Don't beat yourself up. We're all sinners, remember? Just pray humbly and honestly, and God will help you figure this out." Rob smiled, and there was such an open expression on his face that she felt a sudden connection between them, one that went beyond mere attraction, as though they'd known each other forever. "You make it all sound so simple," he said. "I wish I could be more like you." Her cheeks flamed. His admiration was heartwarming, but she was a sinner too, and far from perfect. His gaze dropped down again. "Now I'm sorry," he murmured. "You've just had a nightmare, and here I am pouring out my soul to you." "It's okay. I'm glad you feel you can talk to me. Embrace the journey, because it certainly sounds as though you're on one." "Yeah, I guess I am." He gave a small chuckle. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, and then he pushed to his feet.
Will you be able to go back to sleep? Because if not, we can watch some terrible early morning TV if you need the company. Whatever you need." She laughed. "That's very sweet, but I think I'll try and grab some more sleep before I resort to the shopping channel. Thank you, honestly. You and your whole family have been amazing. You're pretty amazing yourself." Their gazes connected, and for a moment, time stood still before he turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Her mind spun and her heart pounded, and there was a tingle in the pit of her stomach. Maybe her emotions were exposed because of the events of the day, but if she were honest, she was falling for Eastbrooke's most eligible bachelor, and it seemed he was falling for her. She eased her head onto the pillow. Too much was happening for her to figure out what that meant, or what it might signify, if anything, for her future. Rob was looking after her as part of his job. She knew that. But she'd seen a different side to him tonight, and it drew her closer to him. God was working on him, softening him, and that made her glad. She pulled the blanket tighter. It was too much to think about right now. She started to murmur the Lord's Prayer under her breath, but she was asleep before she reached the third line. This time, there were no nightmares.
Chapter 14. Rob glanced at Emma as they walked into the station. Her face was pinched, and dark circles hung under her eyes, no doubt from her broken sleep the night before. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked. She gave a nod, but didn't speak. "If at any time it gets too much," he told her, "just say the word and I'll get you out of there." "Thank you," she murmured, giving him a grateful smile. She had been quiet all morning, turning down his offer of breakfast and nibbling on a cheese sandwich for lunch. They'd sat and watched sitcoms together, and she seemed more relaxed, but when the phone rang, she flinched. When he told her that Myers wanted her to pick the shooter out of a lineup, however, she nodded defiantly. "You don't have to do it," he said. "You're not under any obligation." "I want to," she replied in a tone that brooked no argument, and he'd again been impressed by her quiet strength. Having her around the house had been both pleasant and unsettling. He tried hard not to think what it would be like having her around on a more permanent basis. While the female constable had been there, it was almost as if she wasn't, like she knew she was simply there out of protocol. He held the door open for Emma and then led her to the viewing room. Detective Myers was there. He stood and held his hand out. "Good afternoon, Miss Humphreys. Thanks for agreeing to do this." "You're welcome," she said quietly, but her gaze flicked to Rob as though for reassurance. "The interior window," Myers said, nodding at the far wall, "is a mirror on the other side. In a moment, 7 men will line up. All you need to do is take a good look at them, and if you see the man who attacked you yesterday, tell me the number. They can't see you." "But he'll know it's me," she pointed out. "It's to keep him from intimidating you, to make you as comfortable as possible." She took a deep breath and stepped towards the window. "I'm ready." 7 men trooped in and stood in an orderly line, facing what to them was a mirror. The 6th man stared into the mirror as though he could see through it, a clear look of menace in his eyes. Lewis. Rob swallowed down his rage at seeing him again, remembering the way the man had so coldly given the order to shoot Emma. He wouldn't let himself think about what could have happened if he hadn't followed the small voice within and swung by her house. "Number 6, she said immediately. "You are absolutely sure?" Myers asked. 100%. She faced Rob, her eyes pleading. "Can we go now?" He nodded. "Yes, let's go." He spoke to Myers. "Keep me updated?" "Of course." Back in the car, Emma rested her head against the seat and exhaled a long breath. "I'm glad that's over." "Well done. It must have been difficult so soon after yesterday, and you identified the right guy. It's not always as obvious as you think. Shock can do funny things to memories." She faced him and gave a small smile.
The limp confirmed it. I thought he'd be more injured, though. Just a flesh wound, but a painful one, Rob said. We shoot to wound, not to kill. Does it ever scare you? She asked as he started the engine and pulled out of the car park. Shooting people? Not so much the actual act, but having all that power over someone's life. He pondered the question. He'd never thought of it that way. I don't suppose I've ever really thought of it as power, just a responsibility. We're here to protect the public, not gun down criminals unless we have to. Although cop shows make it look more glamorous, I suppose. She smiled again. You're a good guy, she said decisively. His heart warmed at her appraisal, although their conversation the night before came to mind. You think so? She nodded and laid her head against the seat and closed her eyes. You're a hero, she murmured. He didn't reply, but a ripple of pride flowed through him, despite trying to keep it in check since the pastor's sermon had moved him so much. For some reason, though, Emma's opinion felt more important to him than most, and somehow it felt right. Back at his house, she went up for a nap while he pottered around doing some chores. It felt odd not being at work, almost like a holiday. But he was ever watchful. He couldn't afford to drop his guard. She came back down in the early evening and they ordered a takeaway and watched a film about the American Civil War. They'd invited Constable Jenkins to join them, but she said she was happy to do her own thing. As the credits rolled, he caught himself looking at Emma and studying her profile. She had an elegance about her that was wholly natural and that she seemed completely unaware of. He averted his gaze as she turned to him, embarrassed that she'd caught him staring. Is everything okay? She asked. Yes, he said quickly. I meant to tell you that Myers phoned while you were asleep. After you identified Lewis, they offered him a plea deal, and he gave them details of the operation. There's a deal happening in the early hours of the morning. Wow, that all happened quickly? He nodded. Myers was good, although admitting it irked him. Lewis would have been pretty desperate, facing both a long prison stretch and the boss man unhappy with him. Men like Eric Horsburden have a long reach. Lewis wouldn't be safe anywhere without protection, in jail or otherwise. Emma shook her head, her eyes wide. This is a whole new world to me. I'm just an average schoolteacher. Hardly average, Rob chuckled lightly, then said, You grew up in Ethiopia. I'm sure things are hard there. She nodded thoughtfully. It's not an easy life. There's so much suffering, but people have such strong faith, probably stronger than in the developed world where things are easier. Rob glanced down at his hands. I admire that about you, he said quietly. Your faith, I mean. He lifted his gaze to hers. You remind me of my mother. No matter what life throws at her, even losing Dad, she never wavers in her faith or her values. I wish I were more like her. Emma's brows lifted. You seem a highly principled person, just like her. Well, in that respect, maybe. But faith doesn't come as easily to me as it does to her. Like I told you last night, there's so much I've realized I don't know, even though I grew up in church. She smiled at him with her gorgeous, soulful eyes. Faith isn't an intellectual exercise, she said softly. It doesn't come from the mind, as much as our minds are a blessing. It comes from the heart. He felt a sudden and uncharacteristic urge to pour his out to her, just like he had the night before. It wasn't like him to want to open up, but her calm acceptance of him made it seem like the most natural thing in the world to do. I think maybe that's where my problem is. He took a deep breath. I've always guarded my heart, ever since Dad died. I've kept a part of myself locked away. It's only now that I understand how that has affected my relationship with God as well. It's always been about keeping the commandments and being good, and taking pride in that. But now I get it. It's about a relationship with Him. Her eyes sparkled. That's exactly what it is. And it's the best relationship you'll ever have. He smiled wryly. It's not like I have much to compare it to.
Really? She raised a disbelieving eyebrow. His cheeks warmed. I know I've got a reputation as a charmer, he admitted sheepishly. And I've been on a few dates. Eastbrooke's a small town. But that's as far as it goes. I don't sleep around, and I've always been wary of relationships. I tell myself it's because of my job, but I know it's also about keeping my heart safe. I think I use the charmer image as a bit of a front. Her gaze narrowed. So, when you asked me out for coffee, I meant nothing disrespectful. I genuinely wanted to get to know you. There was a pause, perhaps one of the most uncomfortable of his life as he stopped himself from leaning forward and kissing her. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't be telling you all this. She shook her head. Not at all. I'm honoured you have. She looked thoughtful and then asked, Can I pray for you? He blinked. Pray for me? It should be him praying for her. He cleared his throat and agreed. What else could he do? She bowed her head and clasped her hands together. He did the same. When she spoke, her voice was low and soothing, but also throbbing with emotion, and Rob felt a whisper of something long buried move through him. Lord, watch over Rob and keep him safe. He's your precious child, and you're always there for him, whether he knows it or not. Open his heart that he may come to you fully, Lord, in humility and with awareness of your deep and abiding love for him. Give him the assurance that he doesn't need to earn your grace, and that you love him because he's your child, not because of anything he achieves or does. Free him from fear, so that his heart may be open to love. In Jesus' precious name, Amen. Amen, he echoed. He kept his head bowed as a sudden stillness came over him and a peace he'd never felt before flowed through him, soothing his frazzled nerves. He felt the sense of a presence around him, a sense of being held and cherished, and it brought tears to his eyes. He blinked them back, and when he looked up, Emma was smiling at him. That was wonderful, thank you. He got up and cleared the plates and rubbish away, needing to ground himself in the ordinary. When he returned, Emma was standing up, stretching. I don't know why I'm so tired, she complained, but I think I need an early night. Will you wake me if you hear anything from Myers? Of course, he said. Good night, Emma. Good night, Rob, she said as she headed up the stairs. Chapter 15. The smell of cooking bacon wafted through the house the next morning. It was early, but Rob was clearly up and making breakfast. It had taken Emma a long time to drift off as she replayed the lineup over and over again. The man's dark, unwavering gaze, trying to intimidate her, threaten her, as she'd flashed back to him standing in her kitchen doorway, ordering the other man to shoot her. It had taken more bravery than she'd known she possessed to turn to the detective and that one, number 6. She hadn't been worried about nightmares as she tossed and turned, though, as interspersed with the memories of Lewis's face had been her talk with Rob, and the tangible presence that had settled in the space between them as she prayed for him. She felt closer to him and grateful for God for putting him in her path, even if they were never destined to be more than friends. Although she had to admit to herself, finally, that she wanted more than that. She was glad she'd been able to inspire his commitment to faith in some small way. And she could hardly fail to be grateful for him protecting her. A shudder ran up her spine. Without him, she may well not be here. As she approached the kitchen, the smell was now suspiciously like bacon burning, and as she entered, Rob was grumbling under his breath and throwing pieces of charred meat into the bin. He looked up with a sheepish expression on his face. I was hoping to surprise you with breakfast, but, well, you can see it's not going according to plan. She laughed at his expression. I could smell it before I could see it. Do you want me to try?
I enjoy cooking. He rubbed the back of his neck. That was the last of the bacon. It was my third attempt. I'm not usually such a terrible cook. Okay, she laughed again. Do you have eggs, milk and flour? I think so. Right, move over. We're having pancakes. He grinned apologetically and moved out of the way as she headed to the counter. Then he opened the cupboards and passed her the ingredients she asked for. Do you have lemon and sugar? Yes, one moment. I'm getting spoiled. This reminds me of being a kid. He flashed a boyish smile that made him look incredibly vulnerable, and her heart melted. She looked away, suddenly shy at the feelings welling in her. She combined the ingredients and started to mix the pancake batter, making enough for both them and Constable Jenkins, who was taking a shower. 10 minutes later, she and Rob sat together around the table, Constable Jenkins opting to have hers out on the porch in the sun, tucking into what Rob announced were the best pancakes he'd ever tasted. Don't tell my mother that, he said with a laugh. I won't, Emma promised. As nice as it was to sit together and share such a normal domestic moment, tension filled the room. They were up early because they were anxious for the phone call that would tell them what had happened in the early hours of the morning, whether the sting had gone as the detectives had hoped, and Eric and all the others involved in the arms smuggling ring were safely in custody. Then, perhaps, although she'd never been able to forget the traumatic experience, life could hopefully go back to normal. Rob seemed to pick up on her thoughts. He swallowed the last of his pancake and met her gaze. It's horrible, isn't it? This waiting. It certainly seems to make a minute seem like an hour, Emma said, sighing. But this must be harder for you. I imagine you're used to being in the middle of the action. Yes, he nodded. And I did feel that when I was first taken off the case. But honestly, I'm glad I'm here with you. He held her gaze, and her insides grew warm as she stared into his eyes, acutely aware of the deepening connection between them. When he opened his mouth to speak, her chest tightened with anticipation, but whatever he was about to say would be left unsaid because his phone rang loudly, making her jump. He snatched it up. Hello? He turned it onto speakerphone and set it in the middle of the table so she could hear. It's Myers, he mouthed. Get Constable Jenkins. Emma hurried to the front door of the house to get her. She didn't want either of them to miss what Detective Myers had to say. I have mixed news, I'm afraid, Detective Myers began in a clipped tone. He sounded exhausted, and Emma guessed he'd had a long night. Go on, Rob said warily. We intercepted the meeting and apprehended most of Eric's men, and those on the other end of the deal. I'll give you those details when Miss Humphreys is not in earshot. Of course. You said Eric's men, but not Eric? Rob's eyebrows quirked. He wasn't present, I imagine because he suspected Lewis informed. No doubt he'll be long gone, although we have a manhunt after him since we can finally pin something on him. The detective sounded angry, and Emma felt sympathy for him. To have their target so neatly in their grasp and then have him slip away, no doubt to cause more havoc in the world, must be incredibly frustrating. She glanced at Rob. He, too, looked grim, echoing Myers's mood. What's happened with Lewis now? I presume you still have to uphold his plea deal? Rob asked. Well, yes, he gave us the information, and other than Horsburden himself, we do have the other perpetrators in custody. But this is the problem. Lewis had to come with us to show us the exact location. There was something of a skirmish, and in the chaos, he got away. Emma's heart stopped. She glanced at Rob. He was staring at the phone, and his face paled. Is Emma in danger? He asked quietly. There was a pause before Myers replied. I hope not. To harm Emma now would be counterintuitive, but so was running away after we offered him a deal. Of course, he might have assumed it wouldn't hold since we didn't get Eric. What Myers said made sense. There was no reason for Lewis to come after her now, but Rob was still staring at the phone, worry etched in his features. "There's a bud in your voice, Myers. I can hear it," he said. Myers sighed. "Take Miss Humphreys off the call, please, Carlton." "No," Emma said quickly. Rob's brows drew together as he lifted his gaze. "I mean, assuming it isn't classified information, if it concerns my welfare, I have the right to know what you're going to say," she said. He gave a nod. "She's right," Rob said to Myers. Myers sighed audibly through the phone. "This is just a gut feeling, but Lewis is unstable. He won't be thinking straight. He tested positive for crystal meth at the hospital, and he was clearly in withdrawal yesterday. It might make him more likely to act rashly and aggressively. It would make little sense for him to come after Emma again, but I'd like to keep her in protective custody while we try and locate him. He's probably left town, but he might not have. We have a team trying to locate him." Icy tendrils of fear squeezed Emma's chest as her gaze darted around. She inhaled sharply, barely registering the last part of the call as Rob finished the conversation with Myers. He leaned across the table, his eyes searching her face. "Emma, are you okay?" She nodded, willing herself to be brave. "Yes," she said, though her mouth was dry. "I'm fine. Myers worried me a bit. But like you said, there's no real reason for Lewis to come for me now, is there?" Rob nodded reassuringly. "I'm sure Myers is simply taking precautions," he told her, but Emma didn't miss the flicker of anxiety in his eyes. The phone rang again. Jean's name flashed on the screen. Rob pressed the answer button. Jean's cheerful voice echoed through the small kitchen.
"Hello, love. I was just passing by, so I thought I'd stop by and check on Emma's place. Do a little clean-up for her."
Emma smiled at Jean's kindness. "Thank you," she replied. "That's really lovely, but honestly, you shouldn't have."
"Oh, it's no bother, dear," Jean trilled. "I'm just phoning because it seems you have left your back door open."
The hairs on Emma's arms stood up as she lifted her gaze to Rob's, whose dawning horror reflected her own. "It wasn't left open," Emma whispered. "Mum!" Rob shouted urgently. "Get out of there!" There was a sudden noise, followed by a scream. "Mum!" Rob yelled. The line went dead. Chapter 16. Rob inhaled deeply as he approached the front door of Emma's house, with her slightly behind him. This had to be the craziest plan he'd ever heard of in his life, and he still couldn't quite believe that he'd been crazy enough to agree to it. The minute the phone had gone dead, he'd grabbed his gun and sprinted to the front door, yelling at Emma to stay with Constable Jenkins and ordering her to call Myers back. Then he'd spun around as the phone rang again. "It's your mum," Emma said, her face deathly white as he answered it. Rob had been praying that something had just startled his mother and that nothing dreadful had happened to her. But as Lewis's deep voice came through the speaker, terror and rage rolled through him. "Where's my mother?" he growled, his hands shaking. "You can have your mummy back," Lewis said in a mocking tone, although Rob hadn't missed the edge of desperation to it. "When you bring me that little snitch of a teacher, I'll do a trade." Rob fought to keep his voice calm. Antagonizing the man would only make the situation 10 times worse. "You don't need to do this, Lewis. Just hand yourself in. I spoke to Myers just now. The deal's still on the table. You'll blow it if you get yourself into more trouble." There was a pause, and Rob prayed that Lewis would see the sense in what he was saying, even as he knew that desperate men were rarely able to think straight. But Lewis was also in the grips of drug withdrawal, and thus even more on the edge. "I don't believe you," he spat. "It's true," Rob said quietly, trying to sound convincing. Generally, he had quite good negotiation skills, but this was way beyond anything he'd ever faced. His mother's life was in danger. "You're a liar," Lewis growled. "Bring the teacher if you want your mother back in one piece." The phone went dead again. Rob roared with frustration. He ran out the door, only to turn and see Emma and the female constable following. "You can't come," he told Emma. "But it's me he wants," she said simply. "If you turn up on your own, won't you make him even angrier? Let's at least get in the car. And you can phone Detective Myers on the way and tell him what's going on." Her common-sense approach snapped him back into cop mode, and he nodded as the three of them got into the car. He still wasn't happy with the plan of entering the house with Emma. Offered to do the trade for his mother and lure Lewis out somehow, where Myers's men could close in and take him into custody without using violence. The whole thing was a terrible idea, and he believed it would be better if he went alone rather than putting Emma in danger as well. But she agreed with Myers and said she was going whether Rob liked it or not. He had no choice. When they arrived, he gave her his spare, unloaded gun and showed her how to hold it. Fear filled her eyes, but she bravely swallowed it down. Before he got out, he instructed her to stay put, but she didn't listen and got out of the car and followed him. Although he couldn't see them, he knew that Myers and an armed team were surveilling the house. If he had the time to look, he'd spot the cars and possibly a hidden sniper or two. He had to hand it to Myers. The man had assembled his team and got them into position within minutes of Rob's frantic phone call. He cautiously approached Emma's front door, trying not to think what he might find inside. "Please, God," he prayed fervently, "keep both my mother and Emma safe. I don't care about myself, but please give them your protection. I beg of you." He'd never felt so in need of the Lord's intervention as he did now. "Lewis," he yelled through the door, "it's Officer Carlton. I have Emma Humphreys with me. You need to bring Jean Carlton out." Movement sounded inside. Then Lewis called through the door. "I'm not stupid," he all but growled, sounding even more unhinged. "Bring her in here." "I'm not going to do that, Lewis. At least not until I see that my mother's safe," Rob called back, fighting to keep calm and not just kick the door down and rescue his mum. Thankfully, his years of training were serving him well, helping him to maintain calm. Eli was at the station, under the watchful eyes of Jerry and Johnson. His hot-headed younger brother wouldn't be able to keep his cool in this situation. "I'm not coming out," Lewis yelled back. Rob swallowed his frustration. He'd expected this. "Okay, Lewis, I'm coming in, but Miss Humphreys is going to wait out here for now, okay? I need to see that my mum is safe and well." There was a pause while Lewis clearly thought through his options. "Come into the hallway," he yelled eventually, "but with your hands up, and I want to hear the snitch." "I'm here," Emma yelled. "Stay out of the doorway and don't follow me," Rob told her, nudging the door. It pushed open. He stepped inside and held his hands up. His gun was in his holster. He was quick, but would he be quick enough if he needed to use it? Lewis stood at the other end of the hall, his own gun to Jean's head. Rob's insides roiled with fear. She seemed unhurt, however, and although clearly shaken, she seemed less terrified than Rob would have expected. "Are you all right?" he asked, trying not to betray emotion in front of her captor.
"As much as I can be," she replied. "I've been telling Lewis that he doesn't need to do this. This isn't the way. God will forgive him."
Rob stared at her. This was hardly the time for evangelism, yet she seemed completely sincere. He glanced at Lewis. The man looked pale and clammy, and his eyes were unfocused. Blood seeped through his clothes from where the wound in his leg must have reopened. He was clearly in a bad way, and this would only make him more volatile and unpredictable. "Higher," Lewis snapped. Rob complied and raised his hands higher. "Let her go, Lewis," he said quietly, "and we can talk about this. None of this needs to happen. I promise you, the deal's still on. Let my mother go and there won't be any further charges."
"Of course not," his mother agreed soothingly. "I've been telling Lewis that he needs to get back to the hospital. He doesn't look well at all."
Lewis blinked, looking disorientated. Rob wondered if it was from his withdrawal or his mother's calmness, which was surprising him too. Really, his mother was an amazing woman. "This is a trick," Lewis snarled. "It isn't," Rob promised. "Miss Humphreys is outside. But you don't need her, Lewis." "Not good enough," he said, shaking his head, his gun still pointing dangerously at Jean. "I want her to retract her witness statement. She made a mistake. It wasn't me she saw." "Okay," Rob said agreeably, although the request was pointless since he had already confessed. "You're lying," Lewis snarled. He looked almost feral. He was very close to the edge. If Rob showed any anger or fear, matters would escalate quickly, but keeping his emotions in check when the man had his mother at his mercy felt like more than he could bear. His gaze flicked to his mother's, and although she was obviously scared, there was a serenity in her gaze that immediately humbled him. Rob prayed silently. "Lord, give me strength." A sense of certainty rushed into him, the feeling that somehow all would be okay. He looked Lewis dead in the eye. "Lewis," he said quietly but firmly, "you know this won't end well for you if you continue. Let my mother go and we can talk, you and me. I'll throw my gun on the floor. I can get the deal back on the table for you, as long as nobody gets hurt." Lewis's eyes flashed wildly, and for a moment Rob felt sympathy for him. In spite of the situation, he thought of Rick, and wondered what happened to men like these to make them who they were, so far from God's plan for them. "How do I know I can trust you?" Lewis's eyes narrowed, but there was a ring of hope in his voice. "Because right now I'm your best, in fact, your only chance of getting out of this." "I could run and take her with me," Lewis threatened. Rob didn't reply, and after a few moments, Lewis sagged with defeat. "I'm surrounded, aren't I?" Again, Rob didn't answer. For a long, terrible moment, they all stood still, Rob and his mother holding their breaths, waiting for Lewis's next move. Then he let her go and pushed her forward. "Go," he said. Slowly, carefully, she walked past Rob and towards the front door, pausing only to murmur, "God keep you safe," as she passed him. Rob's arms ached from still being in the air. He turned to Lewis. "Okay, I'll throw down my gun, and you put yours back in your belt, and we'll sit down and talk, okay? We'll negotiate with Myers." He was taking a risk, but he'd rather he was Lewis's hostage than his mother or Emma. Slowly, Lewis nodded and started lowering his gun while Rob carefully reached for his. Afterwards, Rob never knew what spooked the man, whether he saw movement through the open door, or it was simply his paranoia from the drug withdrawal, but suddenly he whipped his gun back up and pointed it straight at Rob, with the clear intention of shooting him in the head. Rob reached for the gun in his holster, even while knowing he might not be fast enough. A shot rang out behind him from one of the snipers. Lewis crumpled to the floor, clutching what had been his uninjured thigh. As officers rushed in behind him, Rob ran out the door to where his mother and Emma stood on the front lawn, holding each other and sobbing with relief. He threw his arms around them both, clutching them to him. "It's over," he said, praising God in his heart. "It's all over." At some point, he was never sure when, his mother stepped away and it was just him and Emma hugging. He looked down at her, and their gazes met, and something passed between them that he could no longer deny.
"Finally,"
his mother said, a grin on her face as she looked from one to the other. Epilogue, 6 months later. Emma checked her hair in the mirror and grabbed her purse as a car horn beeped outside. It would be Rob. She hadn't seen him all week, and anticipation fizzed in her stomach like it did every time she saw him. His smile still made her weak at the knees, and sometimes she had to remind herself that she was dating Eastbrooke's most handsome and former eligible bachelor. And not only was he also a town hero after the events of 6 months ago, but he also seemed to utterly adore her. For someone who professed to once having been too scared to get past more than a few dates with a girl, he'd surprised the whole town with his commitment to her, and the way that he so clearly cherished her. Even so, in the past few weeks she'd begun to wonder if their relationship was stalling. They'd established a familiar routine of a date night on Friday, going to Max and Jania's on Saturday, and lunch at Jean's after church on Sunday. Sometimes he'd pop round for dinner in the evening if he finished at the station early enough. It was a routine that had taken a few months to build. After that awful afternoon when Lewis had taken Jean hostage, it had been obvious to everyone they had feelings for one another, and so their relationship had begun, slowly at first, dating only once a week. After such a traumatic time, she'd needed the space and time to go slowly, and he'd respected that. His commitment to his faith had grown too, just as he'd let down the barriers he'd erected against committing to a relationship. The barriers around his heart had slipped away as well. Over the course of the last few months, she'd found it inspiring to watch his faith and trust in the Lord grow stronger with each day. So, she was definitely very happy. But a part of her couldn't help wondering, what next? He'd told her he loved her, and she believed him. But there'd been no real talk of future plans as they enjoyed taking things day by day. Did he see a future with her? Maybe even marriage one day? She was scared to raise the subject in case she ignited his old fears around commitment. "Help me not to be impatient, Lord," she prayed, "and trust that things will happen in your time, and as you decree." Feeling better for having handed it over to God, she left the house and went to the car, smiling as Rob jumped out to open the door for her. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes admiring. "Thank you." She felt her cheeks blush a little. She'd had her hair done that afternoon and was wearing a new pale green wrap dress that matched her colouring perfectly. She felt pretty, and with the admiration in Rob's eyes, she felt beautiful. "Where are we going?" she asked. She was sure they must have exhausted every spot in Eastbrooke over the past few months. "I thought we'd go back to the restaurant where we had our first proper date," he said as he strapped in and drove off. He seemed both distracted and fidgety. Nothing obvious, but not quite his usual easygoing self. "Did you have a tough day at the station?" she asked sympathetically. Johnson had finally retired 2 months ago, and Rob had been made chief at just 30, a huge honour, and the ambition he'd held since childhood was finally realised. She was incredibly proud of him. "Same old, really. Things are pretty quiet." Oh, maybe she was imagining things, but by the time they reached the restaurant, he seemed even more on edge, even nearly spilling the water as he poured her a glass. "Are you sure everything's okay?" "I'm just tired," he said with an apologetic smile, but he seemed more nervous than tired. Finally, after dinner, she discovered what was causing his nerves. After the waitress took their plates, he fixed Emma with a steadfast gaze while nibbling his bottom lip and took her hand under the table. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, his voice low. She held her breath, hardly daring to hope. "Yes?" He slid out of his chair and onto one knee in front of her. She was crying happy tears even before he had the chance to open the small box he'd pulled from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a beautiful sapphire and diamond engagement ring. "Emma Humphreys," he said, gazing into her eyes. "I love you so much. You're the only woman I have ever loved, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I know this is soon, but Emma, will you marry me?" She threw her arms around his neck while the other diners in the restaurant burst into applause. "Yes!" she gasped through happy tears. Of course I will.
A little later, as Rob drove her home, he asked if it was okay to drop by his mother's house. Emma raised a brow and chuckled. She knows, doesn't she? He grinned sheepishly. Yes, and she'll be chomping at the bit to know what you said. I think Max Engineer and Joseph will be there too. Mum might have made a cake. Emma laughed, shaking her head. No wonder you didn't suggest dessert. But what if I'd said no? Well, I guess they would all be there to commiserate with me. As they walked into his mother's house, everyone piled into the hallway smiling. Emma held out her hand to show them the ring amidst cheers and whoops of congratulations. Jania hugged her, looking as excited as Emma felt. I can't wait to have a sister-in-law, and Polly can't wait to have an aunt. Polly had been born a few months before and was the cutest little thing. Emma felt even more overjoyed if that was possible. God was good, and she'd never felt more thankful. They shifted into the kitchen. The gigantic cake Jean had made adorned the table. You've really outdone yourself, Emma said with a laugh. There's enough here to feed the 5,000. Jean's generosity never failed to warm Emma's heart. The woman seemed to have an abundance of love, and there was not an ounce of bitterness in her heart. After Lewis had been sent to prison, albeit for a reduced time given the information he'd passed on that had allowed the smuggling ring to be apprehended, Jean had requested to write to him, and now she did so regularly. Lewis was reading the Bible and visiting the prison chaplain, something Emma doubted would have happened without Jean's unconditional forgiveness. She was thrilled to gain this woman as a mother-in-law, not to mention 3 brothers-in-law, a sister-in-law, and a niece. Max gave her a warm hug, and then announced that he was going to phone Eli to give him the good news. Eli was away in Melbourne, taking a counter-terrorism training course. The events earlier in the year had convinced him that he wanted to be more than a cop in a small town, and so he was following his dreams. Jean was worried he was on a revenge quest, but only time would tell. It's in God's hands, she said. Joseph was the next one to congratulate them, pulling Rob and Emma together in a hug. I'm so pleased for you both, he said. Aren't you dating yet? Rob teased. You're the next in line, you know. Max clapped Joseph on the back. That's right, little brother, he said with a wide grin. I wonder what God has in store for you. Joseph shrugged. We'll see, he said simply. Emma smiled, a wave of peace settling over her. They would see, in time, what God had in store for all of them, and while she may not know exactly what the future held, there was one thing she knew for certain. God did. Hear my cry, O God. Listen to my prayer. From the ends of the earth I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever, and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you, God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. Then I will ever sing in praise of your name, and fulfill my vows day after day.
This is the end of Under His Watch. We hope you enjoyed it and were blessed by it. The next book in the Heroes of Eastbrooke series is within his sight. Be sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any new releases. Thank you for listening. Bye for now, and God bless.